Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is no gods, no masters in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 26, Long Live the Queen. Flying through an ash storm turned out to be a singularly unpleasant experience, as Cora learned firsthand while at Pepper's reigns. After breaking down their camp and dressing so fast she still had her shirt on inside out underneath her armor, her biggest challenge was not only getting their bison in the air, but steering him into the raining soot. Cora finally had to create a swirling pocket of air that covered his head and the saddle to get him going in the right direction, and then only reluctantly. There had also been no small promise of treats to coax him along with a minimum of grumbling. She brought them lower, hoping not to overshoot the approach to the city Kuvira had described. Visibility outside of their air pocket was limited and only worsened as they continued northeast. It told her that her original guess about Ba Sing Se being the origin had been right, but the knowledge only produced a knot in her stomach. After another check of the compass, a moot point she did only out of habit, Cora glanced back into the saddle. Kuvira still had the side in a death grip with one hand, but used the other to hold down the map while she and Asami studied it. They were getting along, at least. "Hold on, I'm going down more," she yelled back over the rush of the wind. Pepper whined at the snap of the reins, but he descended all the same. They broke through a thick layer of ash, and all Cora could see was fire. Sickly red veins of lava snaked through what was left of the outer wall like corruption, and a massive wedge of it had crumbled entirely. More lava gnawed at the base of the wall, leaving the huge stones to groan and slide against one another while flames broke out around them. Farther inside, closer to the inner wall, all the crop fields they could see had been burned to cinders. The small parts of the sky not choked with black ash ran red under the late morning sun. Kuvira and Asami got to the front of the saddle, looking on in horror with Cora as they swept over the destruction. The land was all scar and gore, bleeding and dying before their eyes. "The whole city will collapse if that lava eats up enough of the ground." Asami ran her hand through her hair. "Which one of them did this?" "Gazan," Cora said, steering Pepper away from a column of smoke rising out of the ashes of a grazing pasture. None of the livestock within view were moving. They began approaching a large industrial building, half burned with fire readily consuming the rest. Kuvira reached over the front of the saddle and yanked the reins out of Cora's hand, pulling frantically to the left. "Don't go that way," she said, trying not to look down. "That's a gas refinery." The shockwave hit Cora before she heard it. Searing light and heat hit her in a blast, forcing her eyes shut and sending pain ripping through her scars. The sound followed an instant later, booming out, and rattling her whole body as if thunder had cracked open the sky. Pepper reared away, but not fast enough, and overcorrected. The pull on the reins was suddenly gone, as was Kuvira. Cora swore, threw the reins back to Asami, and dove off Pepper's neck. Falling was still such a strange thing, Cora thought. Ignoring the unpleasant feeling of her stomach leaping up into her throat, she picked out a tumbling Kuvira through the sting of ash in her eyes. The metal on her armor caught light from the fires around them, providing a dazzling beacon to aim for, but the ground was coming up too fast to close the distance properly. Cora whipped the coils on her hip out and reeled in Kuvira before turning over and forcing her legs straight out. What was left of the grass below her feet burned away as fire rushed from underneath Cora's boots, breaking their fall enough to leave only a sharp shock running up her spine. Kuvira collapsed in her arms, shaking and coughing up ash while her hands grasped at Cora's back. "I've done that before, believe it or not," Cora said, trying to bring her out of her panic. The ground shook, and Pepper lumbered over to them while Asami tried in vain to control him. Cora kissed the top of her head, fighting the urge to spit out the soot there. It's okay. I hate flying." Another tank in the refinery exploded, briefly bathing them all in heat and light. "Come on, Kuvira, we can't stay here. The whole area is going up in flames. We have to get to the upper ring." She nodded and reluctantly climbed back into the saddle with Cora, lashing herself to the side with her own coils. "Want to give me some notice next time you throw the reins at me?" Asami asked, getting them back into the air. "We almost went into the wall." "You needed practice flying, Pepper," Cora said, still jumpy from the adrenaline. Her stomach dropped back out of her throat as they ascended and another section of the outer wall collapsed in a storm of noise and dust. The remains of a fallen watchtower lay at the base of the next wall, where another wedge had been melted away. Just keep following this street, don't bother changing course until we get to the upper ring. Everything to the sides is a distraction. How do you know? Asami asked. Korra sat back, protectively holding Kuvira's arm. Because it's what I'd do. Huge blocks of the lower ring were wooden shanties and had burned completely to the ground by the time they flew over. The parts of the slums that were made of stone had fires coming through the windows, and rioters choked the filthy, narrow streets. A piece of rotten fruit came careening up toward Pepper, but Asami blew it away. This didn't happen overnight, Korra said, looking over Pepper's side. Somehow the thought managed to make her feel better and worse all at once. The fires might have, but this was a powder keg already. Gazan just walked in and lit a match. Carefully, slowly, Kuvira unbound herself from the saddle so she could move to the front. I doubt he even had to do that. The Queen's not very popular. The tram lines into the middle ring were melted and derailed, while the wall they passed through had bonfires on the top. Less of the district was burned than the slums, but the ruins of buildings still cut along the streets like long, charred scars. The fires there were burning lower, darker, older. An airship hull sunk slowly into a pool of lava eating away at a barracks. Heat and the stench of melting metal dogged them as they pushed deeper into the city. As bad as the rest of the city had been, most of the upper ring was little more than ash and cinder. Freshly stoked fires ripped through whatever buildings still stood, and small footbridges that crossed the various man-made rivers laid in pieces. The destruction had been slow, methodical, and near total. It was the target all along, Korra thought. Blasting charges for mining had taken down large portions of the wall, and lava flows throwing off plumes of smoke worked at the rest. Pull left here, Kuvira said, motioning to the next district over. The Pengao's maybe was that way. Pepper descended until they were skirting the tops of the buildings that still stood. Korra schemed water from the decorative rivers and dropped it on the fires they passed, but they were still too far up for her to exercise much control. Finally Kuvira pointed out a building that was mercifully mostly intact, apart from the collapsed main entrance. Pepper came down on the roof, and after a moment a door opened to reveal a very angry young woman in white and red face paint brandishing a black sword. Hey, who's Korra? Jinora. She hopped down from Pepper's saddle and walked over. Jinora slid her sword back into its sheath on her belt, and Korra swept her up in a tight hug. Man, am I glad to see you, she said, placing her back on the ground. Nice sword. Thunderbolt iron, Jinora said, unsheathing it a quarter of the way to show off the blade. My great-uncle made it years ago. But what are you doing here? How did you find us? Mako. Turns out he's good for something. Her blush showed a bit through the white face paint. Oh, is Mako here with you? Jinora looked past Korra, where Kuvira and Asami were dismounting, then frowned. Mako went back to Republic City with Kuvira's mother to get an army, Korra said. I just hope there'll be a basing SE left when it gets here. He asked us to bring you back there, too. Have you been in this theater for a week? More or less. We've been stuck in here since the riots started. The water's starting to run low, even after we raided the concessions. Korra scratched at her scarred arm. Okay, Pepper could probably fit you all, but we're going deeper into the city. I have to stop this. We can't leave. Why not? Kuvira asked. This whole district is a loss, the building might not stay standing much longer. Because we were in the middle of the recital, she admitted. The audience is down there with us. 40, maybe 50 people. Some more drifted in a few hours ago when the fires started. You should see who we have, actually. Pepper took the opportunity to lie down while Jinora led them into the stairwell and the network of catwalks that ran above the auditorium. The rest of the Kyoshi warriors were sitting on the stage near a few injured people lying on rough white sheets. Their audience was strewn about the seats, some huddled in groups, some laying in the aisles to steal a few minutes of sleep. The dinner jackets and gowns of their outfits were caked in dirt and dust, with rips along the seams. What a mess, Asami said, waiting for the ladder down to the stage to clear. Yeah. We don't know what to do with them. I guess we're the closest thing they have to a military right now. Come on, this way. Some of the refugees looked up as they crossed the stage, watching them with sunken, frightened eyes. Pepper couldn't evacuate them all, and even if he could, Korra knew there was nowhere for them to go. Not with half the city in flames. Jinora brought them to a hallway backstage, lined with several thrown-open doors and picked-over rooms. One door was still closed, and a supremely uninterested Suki leaned against it, half of her face paint smudged away. She turned a lazy glance on them, but brightened up when she saw who was with her cousin. Avatar Korra. Kuvira. Asami, the last woman said dryly. Right. How'd you get here? Why are you here? Is the Zaofu militia with you? Flying bison, to stop the city from melting into the ground, and no, Korra said. Suki and Jinora tensed up and exchanged nervous looks. I'm sorry. There's no cavalry coming right now. It's just us until Mako and Suk can get the united forces here, and I have to stop that lava bender from demolishing any more of the city. Lava bender? You can't bend lava, Suki said. Korra clenched her fist and made the wall opposite Suki hiss and bubble with red before cooling it down again. That's not fair, you're the Avatar. Believe me, I would love to be the only one who can do that, but I'm not. There's more lava out there, eating away at everything. I really need to go and see what's left of the government, so what did you want us to see and hear, Jinora? What's left of the government? She nodded to the door that Suki stood in front of. The king's in there. Came stumbling in this morning after the fires started. Kuvira furrowed her brow. We have a queen. Had, Suki corrected. You didn't tell them. She unlocked the door and held it open as the three of them went inside. It was a modest dressing room that had also been picked over for anything of value. The high, long window on the wall showed a thin slit of more smoke and the red sky beyond. Someone yelped as they came in, and Korra turned her attention on a short, slender man with olive skin, clutching a crown of rose gold with interweaving strands of silver and onyx throughout. Who are you? He asked, his voice small and vanishing. Who let you in? Suki. Wait a minute. I know who you are, Kuvira said, stepping forward to take a closer look in the poor lighting. Prince Wu. King Wu, he insisted, thrusting the crown forward. Are you my new bodyguards? No, they all said in unison. Then who are you? No one was supposed to come in here. Kuvira pointed to each of them in turn. Avatar Korra, Asami Sato, Kuvira Bafong. I'm your second cousin, I guess. She suppressed a shudder at the thought. The one from Zaofu. That's me. What happened? How did you end up here? Everyone was at the palace last night, he said. The Daily kept us inside while the military stopped the demonstrations. Asami looked at him, incredulous. You mean riots? They're still tearing the city apart. I didn't know anything about any riots, I just went to my room and went to bed. Anyway, there was a lot of fighting around dawn. I didn't see what happened, I only heard it. And then I felt it. Everything got really hot, way more than it should even in the summer. There were fires in the hall, and in lava. Can you imagine? Lava in the palace? I got to the throne room, and the queen, she was about a head shorter than I remember her. Fuck, Kuvira breathed, holding her hands to the sides of her head. We're too late. His eyes were glassed over, Korra saw as she got closer to him. Still in shock. And then. The crown was still there. The real crown, not her head dress. I picked it up and looked around the palace, but I couldn't find anyone else. Parts of the walls were falling down and I couldn't get to some of the wings, but everywhere I went was empty. After a few hours I looked for the largest building that was still standing, and here I am. The implication of his words seemed to hit him as he spoke, and his shoulders slumped. Korra felt torn. Her inclination was toward compassion for the young man with his world quickly falling to pieces around him, but a darkly persistent part of her only saw the crown held loosely in his hand. It wanted nothing more than to twist and shatter the symbol, melt it into uselessness, bury it in a storm of blood and red lotus petals. A sharp pain surged behind her eyes as Korra pushed the thoughts away. She pinched the bridge of her nose, and Asami put a hand on her shoulder while Kuvira sat down beside Wu. There's really no one left but you and me? She asked, tugging lightly on her braid. Yin is serving in the United Forces, but that disqualifies her from any actual position here, and Hai is on Whaletail Island with her mother, but she's 11 and even farther down the line than you are. As far as Ba Sing Se goes, it's just us, he said, letting it sink in for himself as much as her. Kuvira nodded, but straightened up and grabbed him by the shoulders. What about Prince Zhu? Ah, easy. He died 6 years ago when his boat sunk, what about him? She let go of his jacket, her expression slipping into one that Korra recognized. A mask, a brave face of calm to fight the tempest underneath the surface. It wasn't any healthier than the ways Korra suppressed things when the situation demanded it, only more noticeable. Oh, Wu said, inching back from her. He was here, I'm sorry. I thought you knew. It's fine, she lied. Do you even want to be king? Korra pricked up. She glanced at Asami, who seemed to be thinking the same thing. Well, judging by the track record I've just seen, not particularly. Seems like it'd interfere with my singing, too. Right, Kuvira said, forcing a smile. Well, that can get settled once my friends and I put a stop to whatever's going on at the palace. A new look of fear spread on his face. You mean you're not here to rescue me? Stay with Suki and the others. We'll be back once we deal with this. Here, take this with you. He produced a small key from his jacket pocket and handed it to Kuvira. There's a narrow door far to the left of the main palace entrance once you've gone up the final approach. It's a servant's passage, some of us would use it to sneak out. You can take it right into the main wing, but you might run into whoever's causing all the lava. She slipped the key into a pocket on her armor. We're counting on it. They left him in the dressing room, and Korra turned back on Kuvira as she shut the door behind her. We're going to have to talk about that. You can't seriously think he'll be anything close to competent, Kuvira said as they started back toward the stage. If we can find anyone else, and I mean anyone else, fine. But if not, it isn't as if I'm completely unfamiliar with governing. There was no expectance or excitement in her voice, only the dull resignation of someone running out of options. A whole host of practical reasons against what Kuvira was suggesting crossed Korra's mind, any one of which might have been enough to dissuade her, but only the selfish ones stuck out to her. I don't want you to go. We can figure this all out later, Korra said as they began climbing the ladder to the catwalks. Let's just get to the palace and take out Gazan. Asami pulled Kuvira up the last few rungs. Do we have a plan for this one? Korra mulled it over while they waited for an answer. By the time they returned to the roof where Jinora was scratching Pepper's head, she had one. The risk with the lava is too much, she said. He needs to die. Quickly. She felt their looks burning on her back, but said nothing as she jumped onto Pepper's neck and turned to Jinora. We'll be back, okay? We're going to end this. And then they were in the air again, keeping low to avoid the slowly settling ash. The Pengeo faded and shrank into what remained of the upper ring, while the remains of the last wall ringing the palace stretched around them. As with the others, a large wedge was simply gone, but where the rest of the walls had been demolished to allow free passage, a huge pool of lava burned at the base of the damage, denying passage altogether. Atop one part of the wall were several spikes shoved crudely into the stone, on which were heads in various stages of early decay. Asami retched and turned away while Korra and Kuvira looked grimly on. There's the rest of the royal family. Military airships were still moored at a small airfield set slightly away from the palace proper, and the grounds themselves were oddly untouched. Large swaths of the outer palace were ablaze or nothing but cinders while the central building still stood. Even the main path was largely undamaged, save for the thin streams of lava lining it on either side. This is a trap, Kuvira said as Korra set Pepper down near the airships. Yeah. It was her turn to sound resigned. Asami and Kuvira climbed out of the saddle while Korra gave Pepper the last of their fruit. Stay here for now, okay? If things get really bad, leave. Don't wait for us. Go back to Jinora. Understand? Pepper growled and bumped his head against her. Korra fastened the right sleeve of her armor into place, pressing down on her scars with a jolt of pain. Good bison. The grounds had an unsettling serenity to them, eerily quiet but for the hiss of melting stone and the far-off crackle of collapsing wood. Cora led them between the moored airships, desperate to pick out moving figures in the husk of the palace. There was nothing. Every small sound sent their adrenaline spiking, every flicker of light had them wheeling toward it. A metal door flush against the palace wall was painted to imitate the sandstone around it, just where Wu had said. Cora dispensed with the key and ripped it from its hinges, tossing it aside and peering in. She let a bit of flame dance in her palm as they started inside, leading while Kuvira kept behind her and Asami brought up the rear. It was a narrow little hall with a ceiling not much taller than them and walls so close they couldn't even walk two abreast. More, even narrower corridors, all unmarked, branched off from the main path. Some had collapsed, some had fires glowing dimly farther in, and the rest were pitch black and silent. Flecks of blood covered the walls, with a few older spots and many fresh ones. "How's anyone supposed to find their way in this place?" Asami asked, stepping over a bit of debris. The metal around them gave over to wood, darkening the corridor further. The hiss and dry heat of burning oak hit them. "They're not," Kuvira said. "It's supposed to be a maze unless you already know where you're going. The Daili use the tunnels to skulk around the palace and eavesdrop." The ceiling groaned and gave way, clattering down and forcing Asami back. Cora and Kuvira whipped around, only to see charred, smoldering wood. "Asami!" Cora grabbed at a beam to yank it away, but pulled her hands back and gasped when it singed her fingers and palms. She kicked at it, driving her heel hard into the wood, but it splintered only slightly, and there was plenty more. "Don't worry, Cora, I'm okay," she said, raising her voice to make herself audible over the remaining fires. "Hold on, we'll clear this mess." "No, there's no time. Keep going, I'll find another way around. Go put a stop to this." She wavered for a moment before kicking the beam once more. Yeah, okay. We'll come back for you. Is there anything you can do with the airships outside? I'll check and see what can fly, go." Her footsteps faded back the way they came, and Kuvira nudged Cora back into coherence. "She'll be okay." Cora knew she was right. Asami was more than capable of handling herself. It didn't make it any easier to listen to her walk away, not after taking the first steps to salvaging their relationship. Not after, she shook her head clear. Not the time, she told herself. "Let's hope we'll be so lucky," Cora said, and they hurried on. After a long few minutes, the corridor terminated in another metal door. Cora clenched her fist and sheared through it, tossing the pieces aside like ribbons. She shoved away the bookcase that concealed the door, and they stepped into the palace proper. The hairs on the back of Cora's neck stood on end. Crackling sparks were the only sounds apart from their own breathing. Large, lacquered columns rose to the ceiling at regular intervals on either side of the hall, and inlaid patterns of gold and silver covered the walls. All this while half the city went hungry, Cora thought. There was no motion in the hall, only a vague heat from the center of the palace. Kuvira retracted one boot and slammed her bare foot into the floor, standing stock still for a moment as she waited with her eyes closed. "Okay," she said as she set the metal of her boot back in place. "Lots of people. None of them moving, except for one in the throne room. The ground in there, it's fuzzy. It's lava. We have to stick to metal in there, he'll throw any earth back at us a whole lot hotter. Can't you do that, too?" She chewed the inside of her cheek. "Not as well as him. I'll cool down what I can, but we need to kill him quickly." "Then let's go answer a regicide," Kuvira said, checking the metal strips on her armor. "And Cora, if we don't." Cora silenced her by crashing her lips into Kuvira's, wrapping her in a brief, crushing embrace. Their lips were chapped from the heat and their armor bumped awkwardly, but they kept together all the same. A rush of desire flowed through them, hot and cold all at once as they held each other. Kuvira ran her hands up behind Cora's neck, keeping them pressed together until they had to break for air. "Don't tempt fate," Cora said, squeezing her hand. "Come on." The main halls were no clearer than the service corridor, with unmarked doors and passages shooting off seemingly at random. At the same time, the path to the throne room seemed reasonably simple as long as they stayed in the largest, most ornately decorated passage that led deeper and deeper into the palace complex. The ostentation was good for something, Cora thought. A pair of massive stone doors stood at the end of the hall, marred with scorch marks around the handles. Something rumbled in the throne room, and heat stung Kuvira's hand as she tried to open the door. Cora ripped up a few pieces of the ground and spun them until they coalesced into a bright red disc, cutting easily through the doors and leaving even more scorch marks. She kicked their way through, only to have another blast of heat and light hit them. Lava seeped through the new opening, driving Kuvira back while Cora reached out, slowing the fire inside until it cooled to a crackling, cindered heap on the floor. "How do we even fight this?" Kuvira asked, coming up beside Cora. "We cool it down. You push down that door, I'll do this one. Now." They pressed on the stone, willing it off its enormous hinges. After a few seconds they gave way, leaving the doors teetering for a moment before giving them one final push. Lava splashed as the doors hit the ground, splattering the walls and columns dotting the throne room and sending up hisses of steam where they landed. Cora jumped onto one, feeling power flow through her as she forced out a massive rush of air all over the room. It wasn't enough to harden the boiling, bubbling pools encroaching on the floor around them, but she managed to cool the largest one once she turned her focus on it. Kuvira rushed in behind her, standing uncomfortably on the other door that was beginning to heat up again, and scanned the room with Cora. What was presumably the rest of the former queen was slumped over against a large wood column, and several bodies with wide-brimmed black hats were piled haphazardly in one corner. "He took out the Daily," Kuvira said, her voice wavering. "Those rock gloves heat up like you wouldn't believe." The deep, gravelly voice set Cora on edge while she looked for the source. She didn't have to look far, only to the broken remains of the throne, where he had climbed to the top of the large wooden badger mole behind it. "Gazan," she said, gritting her teeth. "Thanks for stopping by, Cora. Sorry about the mess I'm in the middle of redecorating." "Not anymore," Cora said with a snarl. "You're done." "Think so? You should have heard the cheers when I put the queen's head on a spike. I won't be done until this city is dead." A strip of metal flew from Kuvira's arm, whistling through the air before striking a piece of the throne Gazan yanked up to stop it. She started a full volley of smaller sharpened strips, sending one after another in wide arcs, some high, some far to the sides. Cora fired her coils at the same time, shooting out so fast that smoke came out of the spools. One missed the mark and struck the badger mole, while the other hit home and snared Gazan's wrist. She pulled hard, not enough to send him to the ground, but enough to throw him off balance while Kuvira's flechettes tore into his skin. Beads of blood dribbled down his body where they burrowed in, and he gave no more than a grimace as he shook off Cora's snare, grabbed one blade and ripped it right out of his arm. "You're the one I talked about," he said, throwing the flechette back. Kuvira diverted it into a column before preparing several more. "Come to die with the rest of your family, Your Highness? How disgustingly noble of you." She clenched her jaw. "You'll wish you stayed in your little metal hidey hole." Gazan tore away the back of the throne and let it melt in midair, shattering as it hit the floor and forcing them back. Cora broke to the side of the room, intent on circling around him and putting her own metal in the back of his head, but lava covered all the ground behind the throne, more than she could cool with any distractions. From the entrance she could hear more metal wedging at high speed into wood and stone. She brought up some of the lava, struggling to hold it at a distance in a loose ball, but it collapsed and cooled before she could hurl it up at him. "Damn. You always were a terrible lava bender," Gazan said, ripping control of the ball of stone from her and sending it careening into her head. Cora staggered back, blinking away the stars in her vision, and frantically brushed away a few pieces of molten rock from her armor. "No talent for it." She took a deep breath and thrust one arm at him, feeling the sparks jumping around along under her scars, when a dull pillar shot up and struck her in the stomach, shorting out her fire chakra. Rather than lightning, the sparks blew up in her palm, stinging the skin there and making her hold her arm protectively against her chest. Cora felt the collapsed lava wrap around her throat and drag her back to the front of the room beside a similarly restrained Kuvira. She gasped and sputtered, fruitlessly trying to bend the earth away while tearing at it. The stone forced her up into the air, and her eyes went wide while she kicked at nothing, trying desperately to get her fingers between the stone and her neck. "You." The noose tightened. She could see Kuvira struggling as well out of the corner of her eye, striking ineffectually at the stone cutting into her throat. Gazan took what was left of the throne and fastened it around their wrists and ankles, leaving them struggling helplessly in the air. "No one can hear you," he said, shaking them slightly. "No one cares. No one is coming to save you. Just exhale and let go, Korra, it'll be so much easier." Her head was spinning. The tips of her fingers grew cold and stiff, aching as she strained against the crude cuffs on her wrists. She tried reaching into the stone that was strangling her, grasping at the substance, at the fullness of it, but his grip was absolute. Her noose tightened again, and fear began to flood through her. The deep part of her mind that only cared about survival screamed out in protest, making her adrenaline spike and the pain of slow suffocation even more acute. White flashed around the edges of her eyes, but small sharp rocks crashed into her chakra points and cut her off. Blood trickled down between her eyes from the one that cut into her forehead. She was dizzy and sleepy. She forced her eyes to stay open, fought for each gasping, insufficient breath. Her hands went up over her head, pulled along by the stone like a puppet, and the sickening feeling of violation forced itself in along with the fear. Korra turned her head as best she could until she could see Kuvira. One of her wrist cuffs was twisting until her arm looked ready to break, and tears stained her cheeks as she wrenched her body from side to side. "I'm sorry," Korra mouthed, but the choking relaxed the slightest bit as Gazan turned his attention from them. She had a poor angle, but she heard rapid footsteps and saw a flow of black hair. The Equalist. Her stomach turned. "Asami." Gazan scoffed. "Doesn't matter. If you have a death wish," he slammed one foot into the badger mole, making more lava flow out from the throne, "I'll be happy to accommodate you." Korra could barely hear the bolus whipping out over the rush of blood in her ears, and she saw nothing more than a dark blur in her fading vision. It snared around Gazan's torso, with one end reeling up and striking him in the jaw. Bright violet sparks surged out from the bolus, and Korra's stomach turned as she and Kuvira fell roughly to the ground. She struck an edge of the door as she landed, driving the stone noose sharply into her neck and cutting off her airflow altogether. Asami threw one arm forward while Gazan was still stunned, pushing a massive rush of air up at the throne and striking his ankles. His feet shot out from under him, sending Gazan toppling off the badger mole and into the lava below. There was a brief, sharp scream, the sickening stench of burning flesh, and then nothing. Korra saw a quick flash of fire where he fell. She wheezed, trying to force air into her lungs, while Kuvira ripped off her own restraints and ran to Korra. The cuffs and noose came off with ease, but her windpipe was still collapsed. She clawed at her throat, wordlessly opening and closing her mouth until Kuvira realized something was wrong. "Korra, what is it? Korra! Korra!" Her voice faded, replaced by a shrill ring in her ears as Asami knelt down beside her. Korra's vision went hazy, and her arms felt so heavy that they fell at her sides, useless. She couldn't even summon the strength to try and breathe. All she could do was look at them, pleading with her eyes for them to do something, anything, while they blurred and tears trickled down her face. Asami looked away and put her hand over Korra's mouth, blasting a stream of air down her throat. Korra's chest heaved, filling up her lungs so fast and so fully she thought it would burst. She sputtered and coughed, sobbing as she did, while Asami held her up. Her hands ran through Korra's hair, soft and warm on her skin. "Breathe, you're okay now, breathe, Korra." The central tower of the palace was still standing by some miracle, providing a stark, visceral view of the city around it. Flames were still burning in the late afternoon sun, and a screen of black ash hung over Ba Sing Se like a cloud. Korra took a moment to catch her breath after climbing to the top, gingerly touching the bruises on her neck before joining Kuvira there. She had reshaped the crown into an armband that fit snugly on her right arm, where the gold could catch the light more fully, but she refused any of the outfits left in the palace in favor of her usual clothes. Wu couldn't have given her the crown any faster if it had been burning his hands. "The last airship is clear of the city," Korra said. "They're going to the embassy in Republic City." Jinora managed to scavenge enough supplies for Pepper from one of the barracks, too. Kuvira nodded and rubbed her arm, still watching the fires. "This is what they wanted? Chaos? A city ripping itself apart. They think it's the natural state of humanity," Korra said. "And that it's somehow better than the way we are now. This isn't better than anything. We should be putting a stop to this." Korra started to reply, but Kuvira only nodded. I know. We have to leave for now. We have to abandon the city. It's just the four of us here, we can't do anything without an army. All right, let's go get it, Kuvira said, turning to Korra. Are you coming back once we get to Republic City? Her look was so expectant, so quietly pleading, that it made Korra's stomach sink to shake her head. I'm going to Kasai. The Fire Nation capital. It's the only place they haven't hit yet, and I can't risk them destabilizing another country. Losing the Earth Kingdom was bad enough. Korra glanced out at a bonfire tearing through the upper ring. I can't let this happen again. With travel I hope it won't take longer than 6 weeks. Right. I guess I'm making a state visit, then. Korra turned back to her. You're what? I doubt what's left of the government will let me lead the army, she said, stepping back from the edge of the tower. Not after losing almost the entire royal family today. And I'll have to be alive to finally get a legislature set up. And I. She took Korra's hands in hers and stepped closer, smiling weakly. There were deep bruises on her neck as well. I can't let you run off while I sit around at an embassy, can I? Kuvira, we almost died today. So you want to run off to the Fire Nation without me? Are you going to leave Mako and Asami behind, too? Don't be so quick to play the martyr. Besides, if I have to be a queen, I'm going to pull rank here. Well, Korra thought, if there was no deterring her, she was hardly in a position to turn down help. She eased forward until she was kissing Kuvira, squeezing her hands while their lips moved lightly over one another. Then I graciously accept your help, Your Majesty. Kuvira groaned. We're going to have to talk about that, I don't want titles to be a fight for us. Her choice of words produced an oddly pleasant feeling in Korra's stomach. There's an us now, she asked, raising an eyebrow. A nervous uncertainty spread on her face. Isn't there? There is, it's just that you're a queen. She shrugged. And you're a princess. It's not a rank thing, it's, Korra ran her hand through her hair. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy about it, but it's an adjustment for me. I spent 20 years having it drilled into my head that queens and kings and anyone else with a title like that was a problem to be removed. All the more reason for me not to turn into a crazy dictator, Kuvira said, stroking Korra's cheek. We should go. They descended the tower to the main palace courtyard, where Asami and Jinora had gotten Pepper fed and saddled. Korra waited until everyone else climbed on before getting herself into the saddle. The others looked sorrowfully at the remains of the city beneath them as they sped west, while Korra gently touched her new bruises, wondering how much of herself she would have to sacrifice before it was all over. Chapter 27, Welcome Home. Mako curled up under the covers, looking out the darkened window of the Bafong estate with half-closed eyes. Dawn was still some ways off, but he couldn't tell how long exactly. He still didn't know how Su had managed to convince Lin to let him stay there. Something about him still being in custody, but the bedroom he was begrudgingly given next to Lin's almost made him forget the scowls she threw his way the night before. Every twist and turn of his body was met with the soft touch of silk sheets, warm without overheating him. If he knew how comfortable the beds were, he would have given more thought to running away all those years ago. Her smart remarks at dinner made him consider doing it again, if only for the sheer perversity of it. He sighed and put his hands behind his head, debating about whether or not to get up and start the day. There was a creak on one of the floorboards outside his room, and his ears pricked up at the noise. A memory of how some of his colleagues tried to assassinate him sprang to mind, but that couldn't be right. The triads all answered to him in one way or another, and he was hardly the most appealing target in the house. The door to the hall slid open, and Mako relaxed, sitting up as Suyin slipped into his room. The sheets fell from his shoulders, leaving his chest bare. It was a much better outcome than assassins, although still somewhat confusing in his morning stupor. So? Something the matter? No, nothing's wrong, she said, closing the door behind her. Then can it wait? I'm half awake at best here. She closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, and in the near darkness he saw her nightgown, very sheer and very translucent. The mattress shifted underneath him as she sat on the side of the bed, moved her hand beneath the sheets and grabbed him. Whoa, hey. Well, this half of you is awake. I'm groggy, Not dead, he said through a hiss, shuddering under her touch. She was firm without gripping too tightly, soft while her hand moved slowly, rhythmically up and down. The motion forced her to loosen her grasp to accommodate him, and Mako squirmed. Wow! Lin was really missing out. What the hell are you doing? Su rolled her eyes and leaned in closer, letting her nightgown slip off one shoulder. Her hand continued up and down, making a shiver run up his spine. I'm thanking you for bringing my scrolls back. Do I have to spell it out for you? I know you're not that dense. His breaths came quick and sharp, and Sue's free hand settled on his shoulder, pulling him toward her until their lips brushed against one another. Jolts of guilty pleasure radiated out from under his stomach, and he cursed his lack of subtlety as his hips bucked. Sue smirked, shifting enough so that her nightgown fell open. Her breasts nearly bumped against his chest, tempting, taunting. She took care of herself, clearly. That everybody could look so good at 51, Mako thought. Why you remarried? We have an understanding, she said, nibbling at his lower lip and moving the bed sheets away with her foot. You don't have to worry about that. Just try and enjoy yourself, sweetie. She did away with her nightgown and swung her leg over to his other side, straddling him and pulling him into a deep kiss that he yanked back from. No, 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 what the hell is this? If I snuck into your room and started masturbating you, Mako had to fight back a whimper as she squeezed him, Lin would rip me in half. You really want to talk right now? Sue asked, moving her thumb clockwise against him. Mako stifled a gasp as she lowered herself further, slowly rolling her hips and caressing him with an entirely different part of her anatomy. Fine. What can I say? I have a weakness for cute, troubled, brooding boys. And the scars aren't working against you, either. Lin is right through there. And that doesn't do anything for you? She's a pretty heavy sleeper, anyway. This is so fucked, he mumbled as Sue took one of his hands and laid it on her chest. She moaned and dipped down, flitting her tongue along his collarbone. It was wrong, he knew it was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to stop her from massaging him with the most delicate part of her body. So fucked. Yes, which is what I'd like to be. Sue kissed him again, gripping at his chest and rocking her hips from side to side. She was soaking wet, grinding against him as she was, and whatever resistance he had managed to call up was flagging as he ran a thumb over one nipple. Are you going to help me or not? You can even call me Lin if you like, she added teasingly. Well, Mako thought, it could hardly make his issues any worse. He grabbed at the taut, supple flesh on her hips, repositioned himself, and eased her down onto him, eliciting a slow, shaky gasp as she gripped his shoulders. Sue worked the rest of the way down to the hilt, breaking out in a wide grin as she hit home. Mako wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her roughly, crashing their lips together as Sue's whole body shook. He could feel himself twitching as she enveloped him, and then realized how in control she was. That was new for him. She knew what she wanted, and she was taking it. He was just along for the ride. They were still for a moment, kissing, caressing, all too aware that Lin was in the next room as Sue nibbled on his ear. Somehow, the risk did nothing to detract from the mood for Mako. They fit together too well for him to care about much else right then. Sue ran a hand up into his hair as she began to move, a small O escaping her lips as she rose up and eased all the way back down. Mako shuddered and brought his hands across her back, holding her tighter as she picked up her rhythm, alternating between rocking her hips back and forth and sliding up and down on him. Each subtle change in motion brought a new surge of pleasure running through him like lightning, coursing up to settle in his chest where her fingers explored, tweaking his nipples every so often before cupping his cheeks for another kiss. His hands moved about as well, sliding over her hips, the muscle in her thighs, and finally settling below her stomach, working his thumb through the short grayed hair there and making small, soft circles over her clit. Sue threw her head back and raked her nails across his chest, scratching so deep that bright red lines appeared in their wake. She moaned, perhaps louder than she meant to, because her eyes widened and shot to the wall that the bedroom shared with Lin's. Mako put his free hand over her mouth with such speed he worried he might hurt her, but she only grinned and bit lightly on his fingers in response. So on top of things, Sue mumbled, putting on the lowest, softest voice she could manage. Mako could hardly take it, and started moving his hips in time with her motions, burying himself as deeply as he could with each upswing in their rhythm. Oh, right there, good boy. Mako resented being called a boy, even endearingly, but it was a fleeting annoyance, swallowed up by the ecstasy brought on by every quick bit of contact, every buck of their hips against one another. He pulled Su toward him, his tongue flitting at her lips while he took over the motion, varying their rhythm as he eased them into a deep kiss. They stopped entirely for a moment while their tongues mingled, playfully battling for dominance, until they picked up with renewed vigor. Back in control of things, Mako stepped up the speed of his thumb on her clit, made easier by the slowly pooling wetness there. A bead of sweat snaked down Mako's chest, partly from the warmth, partly from the adrenaline that soared every time the bed creaked or one of them gasped a little too loudly. It was wrong. It was right. It felt too good for moral judgments right then and there. A few minutes of skillful, sustained work paid off, and Su bit into the crook of his shoulder, really bit, so deep he thought she might draw blood, and scratched his chest as she suppressed a scream. Sweet aches sprung up in the wake of her nails, 8 long lines from his collarbone to his stomach. He eased his hand away and slid it to the small of her back, keeping her in time with his thrusts as she came down. She made a few incoherent noises as she recovered, still shivering at his touch. I should have done this a month ago. The smell of her sweat and arousal filled the room, a heavy, sweet scent that made him buck his hips that much faster. Hey, he said, his voice shaky and choked. Where do you? Don't you dare pull out, Su whispered, her breath warm on his ear. Don't you dare. I want all of you. Mako was only too happy to oblige. He grabbed her tightly around the hips and buried his face in the crook of her neck, thrusting up into her at a feverish pace. The pressure mounted, and she held him in a soft embrace, arms wrapped securely around him. Su. Come on, come for me, baby. It was all the prompting he needed. Mako pulled her close as 2 people could be as he came, shuddering all the way through and listening to Su's appreciative moans as he panted. The kisses on his neck were light, and she pitched his head up so she could reach his lips. His thoughts were hazy, and every sensation sharpened to an almost painful degree, making him hyper-aware of each minute change in position. She held him as he gasped and slipped out of her, twitching and taking short, ragged breaths. Very good, sweetie. What was that? He asked, his voice still weak. That was just what I needed. Su nudged him to one side of the bed and sat next to him, wiping a bit of sweat from her arm. And judging by how much of you I have in me, you needed it, too. I'll be right back. Mako watched her pad off to the bathroom, leaving her nightgown tangled up in the bed sheets. 1,000 panicked thoughts threatened to run through his head, not wanting to be a father and Lin ripping him in half chief among them, but he took a deep breath and found Su's nightgown in the mess of silk at his feet. He folded it and set it on the nightstand, resolving not to worry any more than her. There was a bottle of sake waiting in his office he had been saving for just such an occasion, and Su was close enough to Lin that he decided to count it. She returned as silently as she had left, pausing for a moment to strike a languid pose in the doorway and smile at the slowly rising covers over his lap. Su climbed back into bed, nuzzling into his side and draping an arm over his chest. Firebender stamina, sorry, I'm worn out. You'll have to wait for round 2. Want to tell me what that was about now? Oh, honey. Su cupped his cheek and planted another light kiss on his mouth. You've been wrapped up in plots and schemes for too long. There's no ulterior motive here. I had an itch, you scratched it, and I'd like you to keep scratching it while we have the chance. Preferably somewhere where we can make a little more noise, she said, nodding to the wall that adjoined Lin's room. Won't she see that there are 2 people in here through the floor? That seismic sense thing. Her eyebrows went up, and she gave him one more peck on the cheek before getting out of bed and grabbing her nightgown. I'll see if I can get you off house arrest here, she said, and slipped away. Dawn followed with them as Cora, bleary-eyed, steered Pepper into the Republic City limits. Kuvira grumbled as the sunlight hit her and rolled over into a Sammy, while Jinora sat at the back of the saddle to meditate. She began to rethink her plan to break down their camp before sunrise to get back a bit earlier, but there was no use in changing it while they were in the air. I hate mornings, she muttered under her breath. Her mouth was dry and her hair was a mess, whipping into her face along the gusts that picked up around them. A fine way to look for her return, she thought. Asami yawned, leaned over the front of the saddle, and grabbed Cora's shoulder for support. A shiver ran up her spine. You could have slept a little longer. Not with all that turbulence, Asami said, carefully easing out of the saddle and settling herself beside Cora. Besides, I wanted to see Republic City when we arrive. It'll be good to be home again, even for a little while. Cora nodded, watching the plains below them turn to hills, and then mountains. What's the matter? Just thinking about what you said. It'll be good to be home. I wonder if I'm ever going to feel like that. Oh, Cora. My house blew up, and all the memories of that place are ruined now, anyway, she said, adjusting her grip on the reins. And I know we were only at the Southern Water Tribe for a week, but that didn't feel like home, either. There were things I remembered, sure. And everyone went out of their way to make me feel welcomed and loved. It seemed like all the things you need for a home were there, but it didn't work. I still felt like an outsider. You were still reeling from everything that happened in Republic City. We both were. I'm sure you'll feel differently without the Red Lotus hanging over your head. But what if I don't? What if I can't? Cora looked glumly at her bare right arm. The lines snaking along her skin continued with their dull ache as they always did, though the pain was becoming less severe as the days went on. What if I really am damaged beyond repair? Nothing but scar tissue? What if they ruined me? She felt tears pricking at her eyes when Asami took hold of her wrist and held it up. Scars fade. Look. These lines were all white when we left Republic City, and now they're going back to your natural skin tone. Time is the best healer for all kinds of damage. You're not broken, you're the Avatar and you can get through anything. As long as someone believes in me, I guess. Hey, don't count the rest of us out just yet. They both started and turned around to see Kuvira leaning against the edge of the saddle, looking at them with her small, smirking grin. Cora felt her heart leap into her throat, but there was no annoyance or anger in Kuvira's expression. You've got a whole cheering section, remember? Yeah, anyway. Republic City should be close now. You mind taking the reins? I'm about ready to pass out here. Sure. Asami shifted over while Cora climbed back into the saddle, falling onto the blessedly soft blankets they had laid out after getting underway. The haze of fatigue made her eyelids heavy, and Kuvira settling in against her back only made them heavier. She knew there was an hour or so left before they got to Republic City, and any more sleep would be welcome. Jinora cracked one eye and looked over at them, but said nothing before straightening up and slipping back into her meditation. Cora was out as soon as she closed her eyes, falling into a restless sleep plagued by flames and red lotus petals. When she awoke, it was with a strangled gasp, and her hand shot to her throat. A cold sweat trickled down her arms, and the adrenaline coursing through her brought on the beginnings of a headache. Kuvira sat up beside her and wrapped her arms protectively around Cora's waist. Nightmares. It's not even that coherent, she said, leaning into Kuvira's side. Why can't I make it stop? You have to be patient, too. Hey, I can see the skyline. They turned back to where Asami pointed, and even Jinora got herself out of her lotus position to go to the front of the saddle. A few rays of sunlight following with them caught the radio masts that thrust upward from the skyscraper roofs, gleaming against the lightning sky and Yubei behind them. Cora's eyes narrowed when she saw a half-dozen airships with an unfamiliar insignia circling the city, and Jinora cocked her head as they flew closer. United Forces, Asami said, bringing Pepper lower as they approached the outskirts. Why are they here? Can you get us around them? Cora asked. There's a blind spot behind the envelope that we never could solve. Asami nudged Pepper even farther down. And we're on a Bison, not a full-sized airship. We should be able to get to the Earth Kingdom Embassy without a problem. Cora nodded. And we're not going to cause a big fuss, landing on their sovereign territory. I'll let it slide this one time, Kuvira said, retrieving the crown from her bag and sliding it onto her arm. Cora rolled her eyes. This is a diplomatic Bison anyway, so the airships won't be a problem. You're actually a huge dork, you know that. Her response was to kiss Cora, nibbling on her lower lip as she did. Jinora gave them a sidelong glance, but then yelped and grabbed the saddle as a gust hit them. They managed to avoid any confrontation with the airships thanks to Asami's flying, and the city was slowly waking up when they touched down on the fenced-in roof of the Earth Kingdom embassy. Kuvira reluctantly reformed her crown into its proper shape and placed it on her head, not a moment before two guards came running from the stairwell to look for the source of the noise Pepper had made. "Hey, you can't. Stand down," Kuvira barked, her voice taking on its brusque, military edge. She hopped down out of the saddle, her crown catching the rising sunlight, and straightened one sleeve that had rumpled during the landing. The guards looked nervously at her crown, then to each other, and finally took a few steps back. Korra and Asami climbed down from Pepper's back, while Jinora settled in ahead of the saddle. "Ambassador Lien. I'd like to see her. Governor Bufang as well." "Your Majesty," one of the guards said, holding the door to the stairwell open for them. Jinora cracked Pepper's reins. "I'm going to take him back to Air Temple Island. I'll meet up with you soon." Pepper only barely cleared the roof's fence, while Korra, Kuvira, and Asami followed the guards into the embassy. Korra felt another odd surge of deep-seated, fundamental wrongness, brought on by her surroundings if she had to guess. The building was old and stately, having served as a governmental sub-headquarters when the area was filled with Fire Nation colonies before it was the United Republic. She could pick out elements of the building's original design: gold-trimmed banisters, red accents on the moldings, and most prominently the rotunda they looked down onto from the second-floor walkway. Small spouts where fire had been projected along the walls were filled in with cement, but still visible. Apart from the massive stone reception desk in the middle of the rotunda, all of the room's furniture had been shoved to the walls in order to make room for several rows of cots. The refugees they had loaded onto Prince Wu's airship were there, still sleeping in the makeshift shelter. Various offices branched off from the second-floor hall, and Kuvira made a beeline for the one with the largest and most ornate door. "Have someone go to the ambassador's house and get her down here, please," she said. "This is her office." "Yes, ma'am." "Let her know I'll be working out of it today." "That's all." They returned to the security booth while Korra and Asami followed Kuvira into the ambassador's office. Granite and onyx inlaid with silver lined the floor and walls, while the furniture was all leather and richly varnished mahogany. Korra couldn't help but cringe a bit at the excess. Asami nearly collapsed on one of the couches, and Kuvira planted herself behind the ambassador's desk before picking up the phone. "This is fancy," Korra said, settling on the most inoffensive word she could find. Asami groaned and nestled deeper into the couch. "No talk. Sleep. Flying a bison is exhausting." Korra gave her a pat on the shoulder before sitting on the other side of the desk from Kuvira. Her voice had gone back to its usual quieter, but no less self-assured, tone. "Aunt Lin." "It's Kuvira. Yes, I know what time it is. I just got into Republic City. We're at the Earth Kingdom Embassy. Is my mom there with you? We really need to talk." "Really? Okay, bring him too. We'll be here. Guess there's no point in waiting for the ambassador if you get here first." "Thank you." She dropped the handset back onto its cradle before leaning back in her chair. "I really don't know how this is going to turn out," Kuvira said, tugging on her braid. "My mother is no royalist." "Well, neither am I, and I still like you." That garnered a weak smile, but the fear in her eyes was plain. "Come on, let's take a walk. Get you reacquainted with solid ground. I know there's a nice grotto in the front of the property. I walked by it a lot when I was last here." Kuvira smiled and allowed herself to be led out of the office to the main stairs. The rotunda was still quiet and motionless, with an air of melancholy that the refugees managed to exude even in their sleep. As they passed the security booth, Korra saw the night guards inside, still trying the ambassador's home line. They bowed stiffly as Kuvira passed, while she paid them little mind before bending the front doors open. The summer morning air was still and humid, hanging heavy around them as they stepped outside. A rivulet of sweat rolled down Korra's scarred arm, and she brought Kuvira to the small garden near the front of the property, where all kinds of flowers stood sentry along the fence demarcating the line between Earth Kingdom and United Republic territory. A few people passed on the sidewalk beyond the wrought iron bars, and cars and trucks were beginning to line the street. With grass and dirt underfoot, Kuvira seemed to breathe a little easier, and she sighed deeply as they sat on a covered bench that looked out onto the street. There was less space for a long walk than Korra had imagined, but their surroundings combined with not being on a bison high up in the air seemed to improve Kuvira's disposition. I'm going to have to find out why there are military airships over the city, Korra said, trying to find a comfortable position on the surprisingly stiff bench. Unless they brought them here in preparation for sending them into the Earth Kingdom. They'd be moored at the border if that were the case, not in a holding pattern over the capital. Looks like I get to wring another answer out of the council, then. Great. It was so easy the last time to get them to stop dragging their heels and do something. I hate politicians, she muttered before remembering she had her arm around one. Well. These politicians. Kuvira nodded, looking between the ground and Korra for several moments before she spoke again. It's all right, Kuvira said, lacing up one hand with Korra's in her lap. They leaned closer, inching toward one another until their foreheads bumped together the slightest bit. They were useless the last time I was here, too. She closed the distance between them, lightly at first, but then more deeply when Korra happily answered her kiss. Her taste was familiar, welcoming, eager. A welcome change from the days of anxiety. About the Earth Kingdom, about the rest of the Red Lotus running free in the Fire Nation, about stepping into a relationship neither of them were sure how to navigate, it felt good to forget about everything else for a few moments and just kiss Kuvira. It felt so good, in fact, that Korra failed to notice the flash from camera bulbs on the sidewalk at first. The sound was unfamiliar to her, but she traced it easily enough when Kuvira pulled away with a look of horror at the road. Several reporters, working for the international sections of the newspapers if Korra had to guess, had abandoned their posts at the other embassies to congregate in front of the Earth Kingdom mission. Are you kidding me? Kuvira mumbled. Cameras continued to flash as reporters shouted questions at them from the other side of the fence. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Korra felt her stomach turn as whatever scraps of privacy she clung to burned away like the powder in the camera bulbs. She grabbed Kuvira's arm and led her back inside before pulling the heavy doors shut. The press corps was the only group of people Korra disliked dealing with more than politicians. Reporters didn't have rules. The night guards jumped to attention as they passed, noticing the tears brimming in Kuvira's eyes. Your Majesty. No press, Korra said firmly before following her back to the ambassador's office. Asami only managed a muffled grumble when Korra closed the office door behind them. Kuvira sank behind the desk, grabbing hold of the metal grommets on the window curtains and bending them shut. Asami gave a more pleased grumble at that. Korra went to the window and cracked one side of the curtains, if only to look contemptuously at the press and the guards trying in vain to usher them away. We could have grabbed the cameras, she said, dropping the curtain back into place. There's metal in them, after all. I doubt that would have gone over very well. Kuvira held her head in her hands, elbows propped up on the desk. I'm sorry. We wanted to keep all this subtle and now, that's out the window. Korra put a hand on her shoulder, which did nothing to stop her trembling. Hey, come on, it's going to be all right. This was going to get out sooner or later. So they caught us. At least now there's only one awkward conversation to have with your mom, right? Caught you doing what? Asami asked, pulling herself into a sitting position. Making out, Korra said sheepishly. Oh. Asami bit her lip as her expression fell. Asami. She didn't wait to hear the rest of what Kuvira had to say before slipping out of the office. Korra wanted to go after her, but she felt rooted in place behind the desk. Great, she said. Look, we don't have to talk to the press, we can work the council and then head to the Fire Nation. Kuvira shook her head. Reporters take silence as an opportunity to make things up, especially with politics. Whatever it takes to sell papers. And we need to tell people about what happened in the Earth Kingdom, anyway. Otherwise they might think I staged a coup. Okay, we'll talk about that. Make an appeal for aid, try and get the council to come around to it if Mako and Su didn't already. It might even be enough to make them not care about our relationship. You don't read a lot of newspapers, do you? Kuvira scoffed despite herself. We're just lucky we're leaving soon. She nodded, setting the crown slightly straighter on Kuvira's head. Korra wiped a tear from the side of her eye, and that made her smile. You know, it doesn't look half bad on you. I don't even like crowns that much, and that's not my inner anarchist talking. It's a lot heavier than it looks. Cora didn't have time to ask whether she meant that literally or figuratively before the office door swung open and So, Lin, and Mako walked in. Asami followed reluctantly behind them, arms crossed as she leaned against the door frame. This place has terrible security, Cora thought. Aunt Lin. Mom. Kuvira actually leapt over the desk, vaulting so abruptly that she knocked over a lamp for Cora to grab before running to Sue and throwing her arms around her mother. Sue was slow to return her hug, maybe from fatigue, maybe from looking at the bright gold crown adorning her head. Cora went up to Mako, who gave her a brief nod, but then she hugged him too, surprising herself as much as him. Hey, Water Tribe. I'm glad you're okay, sweetie, what's this? Her expression dropped. Oh. Prince Wu didn't say anything yet? What's left of the government sort of, made me the queen. Mako threw his hands up as Lin and Sue both looked at her in shock. I leave for 2 weeks and all the interesting stuff happens. You don't know the half of it, Cora said under her breath. How, what, Sue sputtered. Cora stepped up beside Kuvira. It's kind of a long story, you'll hear it. How did things go with the council? We're going to need that army. The council was dissolved, Mako said. Cora's eyes narrowed. Tenzin's the president now. It's my brother's doing, he's got some kind of puppet master thing going on from the vice presidency. I'm still trying to figure that out. We got you a brigade, though. Her stomach sank. She had been counting on the United Republic to at least remain stable through everything. Maybe that had been too optimistic. Words about politicians and leaders always taking opportunities to seize more power for themselves crept unbidden into her mind, like sweet poison. Cora shook her head clear and put a hand on Kuvira's back. That's something good, at least. But I'm not sure if it'll be enough. Ba Sing Se was half gone when we left. Jinora? Mako asked. She never did puzzle out whether he returned her feelings or if he saw her as a little sister to protect, but his concern was clear either way. She's fine. On her way back to the temple with Pepper. The other Kyoshi warriors took in some of the refugees, another airship went to Omashu. It's really bad, Mako. We have to ask Tenzin for more than a single brigade. I don't know how much he'll be willing to give up, especially now that Jinora's safe. That may have been how I convinced him to give up a brigade in the first place. We can settle this at City Hall, Lin said, absently playing with one of the wires coiled at her hip. Or at least somewhere where we're not trespassing on the Earth Kingdom. Kuvira shrugged. I wouldn't worry about it if I were you. But yes, let's go see what we can do. She walked off with her mother and aunt, while Mako and Cora followed them with Asami mumbling something about visiting her house. Lin shoved several reporters aside while they hurled questions that went unanswered. Mako glanced back at Asami, but she kept her head hung as she split from their group at the embassy gate. What's the matter with her? She didn't have another I am actually an airbender attack, did she? It's complicated. She paused to wonder if she was really about to commiserate with Mako, of all people. Really complicated. If you say so. Although I see they're both still in one piece, so you managed to work something out. Yeah. Mako nodded. He could be surprisingly tolerable, Cora thought, when he wanted to be. More chipper than Cora would expect at such an early hour, too. Which one did you end up going with? I couldn't get anyone to wager on it with me. Of course, he could quickly become intolerable, too. That's really none of your business. You're going to read about it, anyway. Come on, I got savaged by a wolf and still got you the soldiers you asked for, he said, rolling up his sleeve to reveal bandages covering his forearm. Cora poked at the gauze, making him hiss and withdraw his arm. That almost makes us even for scars. It's still none of your business, but since I doubt you'll stop asking and you're still technically in my custody. Out with it, Water Tribe. I want to know who I have to be on fishhooks around. Asami, she said simply, even glumly. Ah. Might have expected that. You and Kuvira are weirdly similar, anyway. Hey, is she as toned up as you under those robes? That's all, Mako. Korra sped up and left him to his imagination while he followed, walking with a pronounced hunch for several blocks. Lin was somehow keeping up with her sister and niece despite a large brace on her leg, and she winced with every long stride. "What happened to you?" Korra asked. "Bomb," she said abruptly. "Oh. I ran into a few of those." "Wait, bomb? Who's bombing?" "The Equalists. Sato hasn't been here to rein them in. That's why the army's here, as a matter of fact. Better they go into the Earth Kingdom, though. They're not much help here, not that Bolin and Tenzin asked the police's opinion before rolling them in. Not as if we know the city at all." Bitterness soaked her voice, and Korra couldn't help but feel for her. Their introduction had been less than stellar, if Korra was being very generous, but she was obviously a proud woman carrying an enormous amount of pain, physical and otherwise. "I can heal that for you," Korra said, pointing loosely at her leg. "It's healing fine." Lin caught the curb with her foot, causing a strangled gasp of pain. "Fine. You want to try something? Be my guest. I'll need something to do while those two go at it, anyway." She jerked her thumb at Su and Kuvira, who walked along in silence with such tension between them that a blade could have cut through it. Kuvira kept a proper bearing, head held high, but her expression was downcast, and Su only stared ahead, somewhere between shock and contemplation. Neither of them seemed to hear Lin, and so she turned around again. "Keep up, Mako. What's his problem?" "Daydreaming," Korra said. There was a slight fog hanging over City Hall, not to mention the soldiers sitting on the steps, ready for the night shift to end. Lin brought them into the empty rotunda and then the council chamber, as silent and still as the rest of the building. "Where is everyone?" Kuvira asked. "Still sleeping, probably," Lin said, directing them to seats at the front of the gallery. "Dawn was an hour ago. And it's the weekend. We'll be back, my sister and I need to have a talk." So left the gallery, Lin following her with a glare at Mako as she did, and Kuvira visibly relaxed. Mako glanced at them, his face tinged red. "I'll go get my brother out of bed," he mumbled, and left Korra and Kuvira alone in the chamber. There was no expectant, anticipatory energy as there had been in the embassy, only the stale stagnation of an empty, too large room. Dust covered many of the seats in the gallery, and a cobweb shone between two crystals in one of the chandeliers. For nearly a half hour, everything was silent but for their breathing and the nervous tapping of Kuvira's feet. "You know, I'm technically invading the United Republic right now," she said with a false cheeriness. She was so very different when the self-assured temerity washed away, another woman just like Korra or any other. "There's an old bylaw that makes all the ground under the monarch's feet the temporary territory of the Earth Kingdom. It's ancient, and the United Republic never ratified it since no king or queen ever visited, so," she drummed her heels against the floor in a shaky rhythm. "Invading? I'd offer to take you outside again, but that didn't work so well before. What's got you so wound up?" "So?" Korra asked. "I know you didn't get a chance to explain anything to her yet." "How can I explain it? My competition was a disqualified admiral, an 11-year-old girl, and a blathering idiot. This was a terrible idea, it really was. I should have let Wu keep the throne and worked from the field to fix this mess. I was a sergeant, not an officer. I don't give orders, I follow them." "You'll have to, for a little while," Korra said, clasping their hands together in her lap. "What about everything you said you wanted to do? Isn't that worth sticking it out for?" "Of course, but, look, having an audience gives me a bad case of nerves. I hate the limelight, and now I'm front and center. You saw what happened at the embassy. That's not ever going to stop, and I don't know how well I can deal with that. I don't want to have to become something I'm not just to do my duty." Korra pulled her close, holding the frightened, shaking queen. "We'll figure it out. You have me and Asami, and Mako, for whatever he's worth. You shouldn't run him down so much, he's an okay guy." Korra shrugged and declined to mention the reason he had been so red-faced before leaving. "This is going to get a lot worse before it gets any better, isn't it?" "I don't know how much worse it'll get, so I'm grateful you're coming with me. And you know I'll help you pull your country back from the brink. Won't be easy, or quick, but if anyone can figure it out, it's us. You're the Earth Queen. Asami basically restarted an entire civilization, and I'm the Avatar. Kuvira laughed softly, leaning deeper into Korra's embrace. Did the Red Lotus make you practice giving inspiring speeches? She stiffened, muscles tensing as her heart raced, and Kuvira realized the nerve she had struck. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. No, they did make me study speeches, as a matter of fact. Zahir loves his diatribes. That's the leader? Kuvira asked. Zahir. I wouldn't say leader, that kind of goes against what they believe. The others respect him enough to follow his command. Or at least, the ones I grew up with. I have no idea if there are more of them, spread out like Iway was. Or other entire cells to root out. If they have a larger command structure, I never knew. I never thought about it, honestly. Weapons aren't supposed to think, she added, staring absently at the railing in front of her that divided the gallery from the former council's table. Given that you killed one member and helped bring about the death of another, I'd say you're not a very good weapon, Kuvira mumbled, treading carefully around the subject. Like a sword without a hilt, maybe. All blade. Now there's an image I like. Korra dipped down for a light kiss, and no sooner had their lips met than an explosion ripped apart the silence and demolished the room around them. Chapter 28, Vantage Point. Korra, Kuvira, and Asami disappeared into the Earth Kingdom embassy as Pepper began weaving through the towers that cut across the downtown skyline. Jinora sighed and shrugged. She could have cut that tension with her sword, but she was finally on her way back to Air Temple Island, back home. Dread threatened to worm its way in, as it had when the Equalists stormed the island looking for the Avatar, and she had to focus on the breathing exercises that Suki had taught her. Visualizing the air entering her body, spreading down to her fingers and toes before an even, deliberate exhale, it made her feel a little better. She still felt sick to her stomach if she was being honest with herself, but it had been months since she had been honest with herself about that. Jinora rested a hand slightly below her stomach, where a sharp pain was brewing. She needed tea. Pepper pitched to the right, heading home on instinct. She didn't even need to tug on the reins, leaving her free to look out over the city. The airships were an ominous image, hovering and looking down from on high. Why, she wondered. Her father would never have supported turning the military on their own people. Aunt Lin would have given him and the rest of the council hell about it, at least. She turned back to the bay, and felt her hackles rise. Warships. A significant portion of the United Forces Navy sat in the harbor, making a thick, double-layered blockade against the ocean beyond. There was no other motion on the water, no barges, no fishing trawlers. Apart from the military, the city seemed dead. She picked out a cutter in the blockade line with silver trim rather than gold and a tiger shark painted on its bow. That's Uncle Bumi's ship, she mumbled. How could he be a part of this? What are they doing? Pepper offered no answers, only swooping low to line up with the main courtyard of the island. Her tension had rubbed off on him, and they came in too fast, clipping several treetops before skittering onto the tiles in the courtyard. She was thrown clear and slid on her side, rolling several times before coming to rest near the Bagua circle. Ow, Jinora said, sitting up and rubbing her shoulder where the fabric of her shirt ripped away. Pepper came up to her and licked the side of her face, and she knew she couldn't stay mad at him. Well, any landing you can walk away from. Stop right there. 3 guards spilled out of her home, fire bursting from their hands. Jinora cocked an eyebrow, still rubbing her chafed shoulder. Their uniforms looked like the ones the police wore, but not quite the same. The badges they wore on their belts had a different shape, and a red chevron adorned their left sleeves. Hey, I live here, who are you? Put the weapon down. She looked at her belt and realized she was indeed still wearing her sword, the feeling of its heft rushing back after so long spent sitting down. Look, I don't know who you think you are. Jinora. Pema emerged from the house, bleary-eyed and slipping on her bathrobe. One of the guards moved protectively in front of her, but she pushed him aside, smacking his hand as she passed. Put those away, that's my daughter. They stepped back while Pema rushed over, nearly falling to her knees as she threw her arms around Jinora. She could feel her mother's tears falling against her neck and shoulder as she returned the embrace. Jinora, my sweet baby, you're safe, You had us so worried. What were you thinking, running off to Ba Sing Se? And why do you have a sword? I didn't run off to Ba Sing Se, Mom, Jinora said, trying to move around in Pema's grip to breathe better. We went there for a recital and the city fell apart around us. I mean, we guarded the Earth King for the whole 8 hours when he actually was the king. Now who are the firebenders running out of the house? Earth King. It was clear there was something of a communication issue, and both of them were too excited to get much helpful information from the other. Can we just go inside, please? My period is about to start and the cramps are really bad. I need some of that tea you make. She swept Jinora up in her arms, and though she felt some slight indignity at being carried as a 17-year-old, it was so perversely satisfying to stick her tongue out at the guard who had yelled at her as she passed him. Never too old for a bit of vindictiveness, she supposed. Please see to Pepper, Pema said to them before bringing Jinora inside. The kitchen was odd, not at all like she remembered. All the furniture had been rearranged, the doors were thicker, and platinum bars crisscrossed the windows. Pema set her down at the table and went to put a kettle on while Jinora took another look around. The soft lighting had been replaced by bright, harsh buzzing, and a conspicuous red button sat on the wall, connected to a wire that ran up to an unlit light close to the ceiling. Mom, what is all this? The guards, the blockade, the airships, even the kitchen looks like it got turned into a bomb shelter. Pema pulled up another chair and sat next to Jinora, smiling weakly and moving a lock of her daughter's hair behind her ear. She fought the urge to put it back and hide the broken-out skin there. A lot's happened since you left, honey. The military's here because of all the Equalist attacks. We've been safe here at the temple, but too many people have died already. At the mention of Equalists, her heart rate kicked up, her throat went dry and scratchy, and her stomach dropped out. Cramps shot through her and she nodded, staying as stoic as she could. Is that all? She asked, fighting to keep her voice level. There was a vote a few weeks ago, the government's changed since then. Dad's the president now, hence the guards. They get a little overprotective sometimes, but that was only because they hadn't met you yet. Daddy is, what? That was pretty much my reaction, too, Pema said, getting up to drop her special blend of leaves into the kettle. I was here with Milo and Rohan when it happened. Ikki was at the meeting with Aunt Lin. She paused for a moment, grinding the leaves up with her fingers much more finely than was necessary, but it all happened so fast that she couldn't tell me much. Even your father wasn't really sure what happened. It was all Boland's, the vice president's doing. She wrung her hands, leaning back in her seat. I leave for 3 months and everything goes crazy. And speaking of crazy, young lady, Pema began, pointing to the sheath hanging off her belt, I'd like to know why you have that. Back to being mom, Jinora thought. She brought the sword out and laid it on the table, letting it catch the light and throw garish reflections around the room. It's one of the swords that Grandma's brother made years ago. Thunderbolt iron. Suki gave it to me before we went to Ba Sing Se. It's not like I ever used it, she added, resting her hand on the pommel. Just don't let Milo see it. He's still convinced he can make a blade out of air or something. She sheathed her sword as Pema brought a cup of tea over, her scowl reflected back at her in the dark brown liquid. I just spent a week on Pepper with the Avatar, the Earth Queen and that Asami girl, can we maybe not talk about bending for a little bit? Jinora asked before taking a sip of the tea. It went down bitter, but settled smoothly, and the heat helped with the cramping. You flew an old lady all the way to Republic City. No, different queen, Aunt Sue's daughter. Korra's girlfriend. Maybe. She had an inkling of the truth, but she wasn't about to try and broach that subject. Not her business, not her problem. Your cousin Opal is the Earth Queen? Pema asked, cocking her head. No, Kuvira is her adopted daughter. Queen Kuvira. I left them at the Earth Kingdom Embassy before I came here. They're really going to need that army that Korra had Aunt Sue and Mako asked for. The tea putting her body at ease and the mention of Mako helped calm her down. Her breathing evened out, and her heart stopped racing. She hoped she could find him at least once before Korra dragged him off to the Fire Nation to deal with the rest of the Red Lotus. Is Dad up? He should really hear what Korra has to say, the sooner the better. Well, If it gets the military out of the city, your landing woke us both up, I'll go get him. Pema kissed the top of her head and left the kitchen, leaving Jinora to sip her tea. Another set of footsteps padded through the hall, much lighter than her mother's. Mom? Do we have any of those dumplings left? Rohan stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, but stopped in his tracks when he saw his sister there. Jinora. Hey, kiddo. He threw his arms around her, almost laughing with excitement. Jinora held her brother there, patting him on the back as she did. Even when she had been at her lowest points, she gravitated to Rohan and their mother, sticking together as the non-bending half of their family. He looked over her shoulder at the half-empty cup on the table. What's that? It's a special kind of tea, you might not like it. How have you been? Mom said it's been kind of crazy here. Yeah. Dad got a promotion and now he's hardly ever home. And we have all these weird guards here all the time. I liked the acolytes better. Mom says it's because of the Iqua, the people that hurt you. Rohan pulled away as Jinora put a hand over her stomach. Right. There were more footsteps in the hall, adult-sized footsteps. Listen, I have to go into the city with Dad for a little bit, but I'll be back, okay? We'll have breakfast and catch up. Pema returned with Tenzin in tow, and Rohan latched onto her while Tenzin breathed an audible sigh of relief. He swept Jinora up in his arms, and she tried to remember how long it had been since both of her parents had done that in the same day. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, being picked up and held, apart from the flat of her sword sheath bumping on her leg, but she rather wished it was Mako doing the holding rather than her father. Good to see you too, Dad, she wheezed, struggling to breathe in his grip until he set her down. I know I just got here, but we really have to go to the Earth Kingdom Embassy. Korra can probably explain it better than I could. Korra's here. It wasn't her father's voice, but still oddly familiar. There was another set of footfalls approaching the kitchen, and Jinora recognized the man that stepped into view, wrapped in a fur-lined bathrobe. She wondered briefly how many people were actually in her house. Chief Tonrik. He nodded, suppressing a yawn. Jinora, right? It's good to see you again. I was coming back from my brother's funeral in the north when your family offered to put me up until Korra got back from the Earth Kingdom. Oh, well, she's here. I dropped off her and the Earth Queen at the embassy. We really should get there, the situation in Ba Sing Se is getting worse by the minute. Let's go, then. She may as well have lit a fire under Tonrik, because he was dressed and ready to go in a matter of minutes while Tenzin moved much more slowly. It was very early in the morning, but even so, he looked exhausted. The sides of his beard were unkempt, hair was creeping in all over his scalp, except for a large bald patch on top, and large bags sat beneath his eyes. Some gray had even begun to creep into his otherwise brown hair. It was as if she had been gone for 10 years, judging by how very haggard he looked. Jinora glanced at the guards sitting outside as they returned to Pepper, shooting them a foul look before bringing Pepper out of the stables. Have you ever ridden on a bison, Chief? I can't say that I have, no. Well, Jinora laced her fingers together and leaned down to provide a step for him. I think you'll enjoy it. Once he and Tenzin were in the saddle, Jinora began coaxing Pepper to lower his head so she could climb into her spot. He finally relented after several rushed promises about not having to fly again for the rest of the day and getting his weight in figs for lunch, but the door to the house opened before she could climb on. Jinora glanced back, realized what she was seeing, and froze. Ikki was walking toward them, clad in a simple saffron robe. Her hair had been shorn away, and in its place was a pale blue arrow pointing to her brow, identical to the ones on her feet and the backs of her hands. Jinora swallowed hard as her sister called her name and ran up to her, nearly bowling her over with a hug. She returned the embrace after a moment, still not quite believing what she was seeing. Ikki had her arrows. That was really it, then. Her sword shifted on her belt, uncomfortably heavy compared to the lightness of the air she could no longer bend. It's great to see you again, sis. Congratulations, she said, her voice sullen as she stepped back. Yeah, I was starting to think I'd never get my tattoos. Ikki bounced from heel to heel, only understanding after a moment that her words had struck like a sledgehammer. No, I mean, Jinora, you're still an air nomad, even if you don't have your bending anymore. She turned away, struggling to keep herself composed for her sister. Tears welled in her eyes, and she bit them back. "Your arrows are so beautiful, Ikki." Without another word, Jinora climbed onto Pepper and cracked the reins. He lumbered forward and beat his tail, rising up into the air and clearing the courtyard. As it turned out, Tonrik's voice could get even higher than his daughter's in the midst of his panicked yelling as Pepper sharply gained altitude and soared over the water. "It's okay, Chief, we're leveling out," she said, glancing over her shoulder to see him with his arms wrapped around the saddle. "Everyone reacts like that their first time." "Oh, Dad, do you remember Aunt Sue's daughter Kuvira? Her lieutenant governor, yes. What about her?" Jinora put on her best air of nonchalance as they zipped between two skyscrapers on Jamay Street. "She got promoted. It's Queen Kuvira now, thought I should give you a heads up. The last queen was sort of assassinated." That prompted a hushed discussion between Tenzin and Tonrik, one Jinora was all too glad not to be a part of. Listening to Korra and Kuvira discuss politics endlessly on the way back had been quite enough of it for her. Their path to the embassy brought them over the plaza that faced City Hall, and near the middle she saw Mako and Bolin, with Asami running over to them. She peered down for a better look, wondering if the others had relocated as well, but a deafening explosion blew out the front of City Hall, sending Pepper careening off course and toward another building. Asami was only vaguely aware of the throng of reporters following her as she split off from the group in front of the embassy. Their questions were muffled and far away, and her eyes snapped shut instinctively at the flash of camera bulbs. She knew the way home by heart, turning at one intersection, crossing the street at another, and apart from the press and the occasional soldier there were few people to pass. If there were, they went unnoticed in her haze. She knew she shouldn't have gotten her hopes up after a drunken one-off out in the middle of nowhere, but she did, and the consequences of that misplaced optimism were creeping in like knives pricking at her heart. They were all public figures, and if nothing else, matters of station made it appropriate. The Avatar and the Earth Queen. She knew it made sense. That didn't make it hurt any less. Near the entrance to her neighborhood, she turned around to face the dozen or so reporters still on her tail. "I'm sorry," she said, putting on a weak smile. "It's been a very long few months, and the flight home was exhausting. There will be a press conference later to explain everything, I'm sure." They launched another volley of questions, ignoring everything she said, and Asami scowled as she turned away. Vulture rats, she thought. Eventually she dipped into an alley to shake off the last bit of the press corps, and the early morning silence hung around her, as thick as the humidity in the air and just as unwelcome. It felt strange, after a week in such close quarters with others, to be so alone that she could hear her own footfalls on the sidewalk. Her friends, plus Mako, were a short walk away at City Hall, and she hadn't felt more isolated in months. She took a key from her jacket pocket and unlocked the front gate to her house, ignoring the overflowing mail slot on the other side of the gate. Various bits of trash lobbed over the fence littered the driveway and lawn, but that diminished as she got farther from the street. "Traitor." It was scrawled over and over on the front of her house, painted on in some places, carved with a knife in others, and burned into the front door with what looked like electrified collie sticks. The equalist symbol was painted onto the one ground-level window that wasn't broken. Asami sighed and unlocked the front door. Broken glass covered the floor, and she chewed the inside of her cheek, holding back tears as she retrieved a broom and swept it into a corner. The air inside managed to be both stale and humid at once, only adding to the unpleasant atmosphere brought on by hundreds of glass shards scratching across the tile. When it was cleared away enough to walk, she checked the kitchen, where she saw most everything had spoiled after leaving it for months. Asami took a trash bag from under the sink, cleared out her refrigerator and left it out back before she went upstairs. The second floor was markedly less damaged than the first, although there was still a long gash in the wallpaper where she had swung a knife the night after discovering her airbending. Asami knelt down and ran her hand through the carpeting, hoping that no broken glass had somehow made its way up to the second floor. The texture, the slight roughness, was pleasantly familiar between her fingers, bringing a small smile to her face along with the memories of defying her mother by playing so close to the stairs. Pain crept along with the thoughts of her mother, made more acute when she realized just how difficult it was to remember her face. Her room was exactly as she left it after leaving with Cora all those weeks ago. She picked up the fire poker, bent to uselessness, and threw it into the corner. The disassembled shock glove still sat on her desk, electrical aperture shining in the light from the sunrise, and her comforter lay rumpled at the foot of her bed. Asami picked up one of her pillows, held it under her nose, and took a deep breath. She didn't know if it was actually Cora's scent or only her imagination, but it brought a sweet thrumming to her chest all the same. When she finally put the pillow down after several minutes, she crouched down in front of her hope chest and wiped some dust away with her sleeve. Everything was still inside, some of her nicer jewelry lay buried in spare sheets, as well as the documents and maps beneath the false bottom she had asked Mako to retrieve. "Idiot," she said, and piled everything into a small briefcase, a birthday gift from her father. The irony was not lost on her, and it brought a humorless smile to her lips. After a hot shower and a few moments deciding on a fresh outfit, little comforts she missed more than she had realized at first. Asami grabbed the documents and locked her house up behind her, lamenting its sorry state for the first time. It looked better from the front gate, but she hoped there would be a chance to schedule repairs before they left for the Fire Nation. If Cora still wanted her there, of course. The thought snaked unbidden into her mind, insidious in its casualness, offhand like a passing notion about the weather. She shook her head clear. Of course Cora wanted her there. They were still friends. She only wanted her friend to be happy. As the city slowly came to life while she took a taxi to City Hall, the bustle around her began to liven up Asami. Combined with the crisp freshness of her new clothes, she felt good for the first time in months. A renewed sense of purpose surged through her all the way to the center of the city, and she took a deep breath as she left the taxi and rounded the final street corner. The plaza in front of City Hall held many conflicting memories for her. Between her first date with Mako and discovering Cora was the Avatar, but seeing such a familiar place put her at ease. A bison soared overhead in the same direction. Pepper, she realized, coming back from the direction of the Bay and Air Temple Island. The little spot of brown fur on one of his back legs told her as much. Mako and Bolin were there as well, in the main plaza along with a rather tall woman, and they all turned to her as she jogged up to them. "Hey, thanks for getting those files," Asami said, holding up her briefcase. Mako opened his mouth to reply, but an explosion ripped through City Hall before he could, and the flash of light nearly blinded her. Lin almost yanked Sue's arm out of its socket as she led her stiffly out of the former council chamber, retreating to a secluded part of the main rotunda. She didn't even want to touch her sister, but she had never been one for sweet words to get what she wanted, and Sue never responded to that, in any case. Before she could say anything, she caught Mako cutting across the rotunda, red-faced and hurried. He was still in custody, he shouldn't have been leaving at all, but one person at a time. She wanted to grab him, certainly, maybe knock both of their heads at once, but Sue would have to be first. "Quit manhandling me," Sue said, rolling her shoulder to get it back in its proper place. "What's gotten into you?" "I would ask you the same thing, or who's gotten into you, rather, if I didn't already know the answer." Sue cocked an eyebrow and twisted her mouth, the way she did when she was trying not to smirk. She was a terrible liar. A bad trait for a politician, Lin thought. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you try and bullshit me." You and Mako were. The words caught in her throat, half from anger, half from disbelief. Sue always went on in her letters about her family and her husband, and not 2 weeks after leaving Zaofu she was sleeping with the one person that caused Lin more grief than everyone else put together. "Damn seismic sense," Sue muttered. "Please. I didn't even need that. You're not nearly as quiet as you think. Either of you. If this is such an affront to you, why didn't you stop us this morning?" she asked, crossing her arms. Lin scoffed. "You think I wanted to barge in on the last triad boss in the city, balls deep in my sister?" A moment of silence followed where Sue had to keep from laughing, puckering her lips while tremors racked her. Lin thought her slip of the tongue was rather funny too, if she was being completely honest, but she wasn't going to give Sue the satisfaction. "What the fuck were you doing?" "Mako," Sue said. "But why?" Lin grabbed her by the shoulders, intending to shake her, but instead she used her sister for support. "There's a whole city full of guys here for you to cheat on Bader with, why did you have to pick him?" First of all, not cheating. I know you're familiar with exactly one kind of relationship, but that's not the kind that Bader and I have. Second, as much as I used to love riling you up when we were kids, I didn't sleep with Mako to spite you. Sex is too fun to use as a weapon. Why, then? Why? You really are just like him, you know that? There's no secret plot here. No conniving, no conspiracy. I did it because I wanted to. He's cute, he's got that irresistible bad boy thing, and he's got a huge... I'm going to stop you right there, Lin said, throwing her hand up between them. So looked ready to go glassy-eyed as she bit her lip in reminiscence. I don't want to know any of that. Certainly heard more than enough through that wall. But the fact is, he's still in the custody of Republic City and the Avatar. Prisoners can't consent. Sue rolled her eyes. Oh, spare me. I didn't put a knife to his throat. He needed it as much as I did, as a matter of fact. Can you imagine having to see your ex all the time? Lin only scowled at her. Okay, bad example. The point is, I don't intrude on your sex life, such that it is. Her scowl grew more intense. And I'd like the same courtesy extended to me, as a visiting diplomat if not as a sister. Mako will be leaving when Korra does, and I have to go back to whatever mess the Earth Kingdom is in right now with Kuvira. Excuse me, Queen Kuvira. That's going to take some getting used to. We'll both be out of your hair soon enough, but you should let him spend the rest of his time here out from under your thumb. If only because you're a much lighter sleeper than I remember. You're unbelievable, you really are. Lin waved her hand and became very interested in the floor. He's back in the Avatar's custody, he's her problem now. You can do what you want with him. With a grimace, Lin turned herself and sat on the bench they were standing in front of, expanding part of her leg brace to relieve the pressure on her thigh. Sue sat beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. Can I ask you something? Something personal. I've heard more about your life than I ever wanted to today. I don't see why I shouldn't return the favor. Right. I know you're upset with me. Angry. Sue took a deep breath. Do you think part of that might also be jealousy? Of all the things in her life that Lin was proud of, what she was most proud of was never retaliating against her sister after she gave Lin the scars that marred her cheek. In that moment, she came closer than she ever had to cracking her sister across the face. It would have been so easy, too. She was in the right position, all she had to do was wind her arm back and let loose. Instead, she closed her eyes and had something new to be proud of. No. I never needed Mako's advances to validate myself. Let him shift it over to you for all I care. I get plenty of male attention from outside the city's criminal element. You're an even worse liar than I am, Sue said. On that account, she had no defense. She was maimed, pushing 58, and knew her personality rubbed everyone roughly, not to mention what decades of stressful work had done to her looks. Laying it all out didn't make it any easier to accept, though. The irritating heat behind her eyes told her tears weren't far off, and she would be damned before she cried in front of Sue. So what? Some of us get fulfillment in ways that aren't fucking. Lin's hand tightened into a fist on her lap, and then relaxed. All those years haranguing me, and he just melts in your hands the instant you show him some attention. I don't think melted is the right word, Sue said, biting her lip again. Exploded, maybe. And certainly not in my hand. Lin made the conscious decision to ignore that remark. So you punched a hole in my ego. Wouldn't be the first time. I'll get over it. I didn't want him, you didn't steal him from me, he ought to be in a cell where he can't drive me crazy. Who are you trying to convince, me or you? She ran a hand through her hair, and a single tear fell unbidden into her lap before she bit back the rest. Sue had an annoying way of digging up things that she would rather remain buried, where they belonged. Another bad trait for a politician. I'm not trying to convince anyone. It's the truth. You know, it's okay to admit you're human, Sue said, putting on a weak smile. We all know you're not the stony-faced police chief all the time. It's okay to have feelings and needs and like attention, even if it's from someone annoying. Annoying? Sue shrugged. Mako likes to talk rather than, you know. Again, eerily like you. I don't even remember how many times I wanted to bang on the wall between our rooms when we were kids and tell you and Tenzin to shut up and get on with it. You can't filibuster your way to an orgasm. It was strange to Lin, sitting there with her sister and speaking so frankly. Even after patching up their relationship, the letters they exchanged were more cordial than familiar. Strange, but nice, she decided. If so was going to be the closest thing she had to a friend, then it would be good for them to be open and honest with each other. Fine. It bothers me. But it bothers me that it bothers me, okay? I'm human, but I'm the chief of police, too. Besides which, it's not anything close to appropriate. Whether we can get the evidence or not, he's a triad boss, not to mention still technically a prisoner. I'm old enough to be his mother. I looked it up, we would be the same age if she were alive, and I tried to take care of them after their parents died. The whole idea leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Sue adjusted the small diadem that circled her forehead, fixing the jewel that hung down above her eyes. You're doing it again. You're trying to convince yourself and make it sound like you're convincing me. Honestly, I think you need this even more than I did. Well, I'm not going to go and jump on him. That's more your style. Lin smiled mirthlessly while Sue smirked. Like you said, there's a whole city full of guys here, Sue said, putting her arm around Lin and pulling her into a sidelong hug. There have to be at least a few you haven't arrested. Can't believe I need my baby sister to help get me laid, she mumbled. Sue had to laugh at that. I think I stopped being your baby sister about a million gray hairs ago. Not sure what I could do to help you, anyway. I'm an awful wingman, and you can't be that rusty. Sue perked up. You want to borrow Bader? Lin shuddered. Somehow she knew the offer came from a good place, but it still turned her stomach. She didn't need her sister's leftovers. Pass. Look, I should get Tenzin down here. The more of the army he can send into the Earth Kingdom, the less that'll be here to bother me. She took a coin from her pocket and stood at the payphone beside their bench. After dropping the coin in and quickly bending it back out, much to the admiring glance of her sister, Lin took the handset and called over to Air Temple Island. It rang a few times before someone picked up. Hello. Her grip on the handset tightened. Pema. It's Linear. Oh. Hi. It's kind of early, isn't it? There was a certain feigned casualness to her tone, the same as when they forced themselves to talk to one another at formal events. She hadn't spoken to Pema since her and Tenzin's first and only visit to her in the hospital, and her voice was tired, strained. Maybe it was from the early hour Lin doubted Pema had suffered through as rude an awakening as her, but something told her it was more than that. Yeah, real early. Listen, the Avatar and the Earth Queen are here at City Hall. Is the president up yet? He'll want to hear what they have to say. Tenzin and Chief Tonrik left with Jinora already, about 10 minutes ago. They were headed for the Earth Kingdom Embassy. She said that was where she dropped them off. Lin frowned. We picked them up from there a little while ago. I'll call the embassy and get them over here. Her hackles started to rise. Something was wrong. It was too quiet, even for the early weekend morning. She set the handset back on its cradle and scanned the rotunda, made all the easier by the removal of the massive monument in the middle. Finally her gaze settled on a brown leather briefcase, sitting abandoned under another bench, with no one in sight who might have owned it. Shutting out the pain from her leg, she slammed her uninjured foot against the floor, reaching out through the echoes. Korra and Kuvira were still in the gallery beside one another. The soldiers outside had gone back to sitting around the steps, and, ticking. The briefcase was ticking. She remembered throwing herself over Sue, and then an eruption of light, sound, and heat. Mako couldn't get out of the rotunda a moment too soon. He thought he knew why Lin had dragged Sue off, and the glare she shot him as he passed through to the entrance only confirmed it. It was going to be a very long day. The soldiers on the steps outside still stood at attention, and he ignored them as he rushed through the plaza. All he had to do was go and get Bolin. The sooner the better, too. Once they got the rest of the army they wanted, he would at least be back under Korra's thumb, and not Lin's. As for Sue, that would take a good deal more puzzling out, and he was still too tired and far too sober to think about it. Once through the plaza, he walked backwards on the sidewalk as he tried to hail a taxi. Most of them were likely at the end of their shifts, unwilling to take another fare. It was only after he produced a small stack of yuans from his jacket that one of the little yellow cars stopped and he was able to climb in. "Where to?" the driver asked, fighting back a yawn. "Corner of Hang and Saifu." Mako dropped the money into the driver's lap. "Keep the change and make it quick." 5 minutes of breakneck driving later, Mako stepped shakily out of the taxi, and its newly enriched driver sped off with his money. It was well spent, although Mako needed several of the minutes he saved to get his equilibrium back. He was glad he never tried to muscle in on the taxi business in the city. The drivers were absolutely crazy. When he regained his balance, Mako started along the lonely street, passing only parked cars and a young boy carrying bundles of papers to newsstands. Bolin's house came up quickly, wider and taller than its neighbors, and more than a little ostentatious with the gold trim around the windows. A man stood on the stoop in front of the door, bored but vigilant. No, Mako realized. A woman, not a man, and a rather tall, stolid one at that. Shen. Her air of boredom vanished when she heard his voice, and she jumped over the side of the stoop to get at him. "Boss," she said, forgetting herself and wrapping him in a hug. That was new, he thought. Not entirely unwelcome, doubly so since the disparity in their heights put his face nearly level with her chest. Yes, Mako thought, it was going to be a very long day. After a moment she seemed to grasp what she was doing, and set him back down with a nervous laugh. "It's, good to see you again." "Likewise. How come you're pulling guard duty for my brother?" "Don't tell me you've gone over to the public sector," he said with a wry smile. Shen shrugged. "We're just doing some contracting. The army's here, and even though they're focusing on the equalists, they probably wouldn't waste the chance to deal with us if we made enough noise." She scratched the back of her head. "Besides, government work pays pretty well." He took notice of her new diamond earrings. "I can see that. Listen, can I go inside? The Avatar and the Earth Queen got back an hour ago and I figured Bolin would want to be at City Hall for the meeting. Might end up pulling out even more of the army. Basing SE is real bad right now, the way they tell it." Shen glanced at the door, and then produced a key from her pocket after a moment. "All right. Go on up, I'll get the car started." "Oh, and, he's not alone," she added. Mako nodded, took the offered key, and went into Bolin's house. The foyer was richly appointed, too richly for his taste, really. An antique Fire Nation rug covered the floor, and small Earth Kingdom scrolls dotted the walls and led up the stairs. Mako noted with some small amusement that a few were counterfeits of his triad's own making. Everything was quiet on the second floor, where a long tapestry of something adorned the wall facing the stairs. It wouldn't have looked out of place with one of Huan's handmade frames around it. Mako would have to give him a call before Korra dragged him off again. Bolin's bedroom door looked much like all the others in the hallway, except that the doorknob was gold where the others were brass. He knocked and, remembering the trauma in Opal's eyes after trying too eagerly to get her sister out of bed, waited for a response. "Bolin," he said, rapping his knuckles on the door again, more insistently. "Let's go. Korra's back, and if you're not there Tenzin might actually start running the country himself." A low groan was his only reply. "Make yourself decent, yeah?" He pushed the door open, and the smell of Beiju hit him hard. Bolin might not have been a firebender, but he and Mako certainly had the same tolerance for alcohol. There were 3 empty bottles that he could count on the windowsill opposite the door, their fumes nearly peeling the paint off the window trim. Bolin himself was still in bed, sprawled out across the mattress with his face in a pillow. "You'll smother like that, you idiot," Mako said, picking his head up and turning it enough so that his breathing wouldn't be impeded. There was a sound, humming through from the next room, and he only identified it as the shower when it cut off. At about the same time he noticed a small pair of glasses on the nightstand, the kind that clipped onto a person's nose rather than resting over their ears. The bathroom door opened, and a slender woman with sopping wet brown hair poked her head out. "Bolin, did you hear something? And are my glasses over there?" Mako picked them up from the nightstand and walked them over. "Hello, Zuli. Here are your glasses." She might have been blind without them, but her ears worked fine, and they turned a bright shade of scarlet as she picked out his voice. "Thank you, Mako. Welcome back." He put the glasses in her hand and she closed the door as quickly as she could. Mako went back to the bed and shook his brother until he got some kind of response. "Your chief of staff? Classy. And how's your morning been, Mako?" Bolin asked, slurring his words. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "No? Was it rudely interrupted by your brother when you were only trying to get some sleep?" "It was interrupted by a sibling, let's leave it at that." The recollection swam into his head, confusing and troubling and blissful all at once. "Come on. Korra and Asami are back, and Korra's got the Earth Queen with her." Bolin turned over, away from Mako and toward the darkened window. "Forgive me if I don't want to start the day listening to some thoroughly unpleasant old woman." "New queen," Mako said, as much for his brother as for himself. They got along well enough in Zaofu, but he hadn't taken a great amount of time to get to know her. She had usually been with Korra, anyway. "You met Sue's daughter Kuvira, right?" "It's her. Long-lost princess, royal family in shambles, something like that." "Can we go, please?" He picked his head up from the pillow and glanced over his shoulder at Mako. "Okay, you have my attention. Let me get dressed, Shen will drive us." Mako went downstairs, all too glad to be away from the smell of more liquor, and examined one of the scrolls hanging in the foyer. Definitely a counterfeit. One of their earlier ones, too, before they had really refined the process. Bolin came down behind him, taking the stairs two at a time. "Like it?" he asked, tapping the bottom of the scroll. "Yeah, real nice. Let's go." Outside, Bolin's car was idling, with Shen already behind the wheel. They climbed into the back and Bolin gave her City Hall as their destination. Almost no traffic presented itself, and Mako watched the city wake up from his window as they sped by. It was no taxi ride, but the tiny flags mounted on the hood of the car made the drive smooth and swift. "So how exactly did the lieutenant governor of the Jinshu province become the Earth Queen?" Bolin asked. "You'll have to ask her. All I know is we showed up at the embassy and she had the crown." Bolin nodded, trying to keep himself awake. "I guess if she's even got our crazy anarchist avatar supporting her, it's all legitimate." "Don't talk about Korra that way," Mako said, much more sharply than he intended. Bolin narrowed his eyes, and even Shen glanced back as they waited at a light. "Don't." They made the rest of the trip in silence, and Shen accompanied them as they crossed the plaza toward City Hall. Mako noticed a bison on approach overhead, with a slight, wiry woman at the reins. Jinora. A knot in his heart unclenched at seeing her unharmed, and the others paused while he stood there. "Can we go?" Bolin asked. "Hey, thanks for getting those files." Mako turned around and saw Asami coming toward them, holding up a briefcase. Oops. He knew he had forgotten to do something. Before he could say anything in his own defense, an explosion split the morning silence, tearing City Hall to pieces before their eyes. Chapter 29, Renewal. Korra wasn't sure when she came to, or if she had even passed out. There was a new hole in the ceiling, and the sky looked much the same as it had when they entered City Hall. A great deal of dust settled on her and stung her eyes, to say nothing of the remains of her chair digging into her back. Something sharp bit into her side and her head, acute and searing while her ears rang terribly. "I hate explosions," she said to no one in particular, and a shot of terror ran through her. Kuvira. She couldn't even hear herself as she stood, ignoring the pain in her side and blood trickling from her temple, and swept away a pile of rubble with a gust of wind. It clattered into what remained of the far wall, and her stomach turned when she saw a fallen pillar holding up the twisted remains of a chandelier. Her jaw clenched, white light glowing from her eyes and scars, and the massive column slid across the floor as if it were so much cardboard. The chandelier got the same treatment, its gold liquefying an instant before it hit the wall. On the other side of where they had fallen, dust and bits of wall covered Kuvira's outfit, and another blast of air cleared it well enough. She fell to her knees and picked up the queen, cradling her and giving her a quick look over. There was nothing sticking out of her, nothing bending or twisting in ways it shouldn't have, only a swelling bruise on her cheek. The glow in her eyes died away, and Korra sighed in relief. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, but alive, and not badly hurt. That was enough for Korra to focus on tearing apart whoever had blown up the building. She tried to stand, still holding Kuvira, but her side screamed in protest all the way up. With a glance down, she saw a piece of a chair embedded slightly above her hip, soaking her shirt and pants red. There were other, smaller bits of stone, glass, and wood biting into her arms and legs, leaving rivulets of blood dripping all over. Each step out of the gallery brought with it an exquisite shock of pain, flashing down into her leg and up to her shoulder. In the rotunda, what was left of the rotunda, she picked out what had to be the epicenter of the explosion, a scorched section of floor that had rubble flowing outward in concentric circles. It was against where the wall to the gallery had been. On the other side of the rotunda, Mako was pulling Lin and Su out from under the remains of a bench. When she was on her feet again, Su stumbled toward Korra and swept Kuvira up in her arms while Lin limped out of the building with her arm slung over Mako's shoulder. Equalists, Lin spat as they got to the steps. Had to be. They just signed away their due process. Korra worked her way through an especially painful bout of coughing as she fought to stay upright while descending the stairs. The few people who had been in the plaza were gone, replaced by Mako's brother and a woman Korra didn't recognize, perhaps his assistant, getting Tenzin, and another man out of Pepper's overturned saddle. The bison himself laid at the foot of a building with a large crack in the wall, presumably where he had struck. Korra noted with a sickening feeling in her stomach that the only motion she could detect was a bit of involuntary twitching in one of his legs, as well as the blood pooling around him. Asami was there as well, holding back Jinora as she strained to get back to her bison. Her screams split the silence that had settled in the wake of the explosion, pained and pleading and desperate. A flash of motion on one side of the plaza caught Korra's eye, so quick she might not have noticed it but for the glimmer of light reflecting off two sticks on the figure's back. That, and the figure was running awfully fast in the opposite direction. Hoping that she hadn't been hit in her fire chakra after the blast, Korra focused her chi and thrust her scarred arm forward, letting lightning spring from her fingers and rip through the humid summer air. There was too much moisture for her to hope it would hit its mark, and the bolt quickly grounded out against a lamp post. It served its purpose, though, and alerted everyone else to the figure's presence. Asami turned and was still for a moment before taking off after him like a woman possessed, leaving Jinora to waver and ultimately follow her at a dead run. Mako went after them as well, but not before setting Lin on the bench where Su had laid Kuvira. Korra made a move to follow, but pain ripped through her abdomen, so sharp and so hot she thought she might have hit herself with her own lightning. She hissed and pressed her hand around the wooden shard, garnering another dizzying spate of pain for herself. All she could feel there was warm, sticky blood and the splintered shard sticking out of her skin. She sank to her knees and a stinging ran through her head from her temple, where she chanced to feel around. The blood she felt might have been from either her head or her side, but there was definitely a sliver of stone there, embedded above and in front of her ear on the side of her left eye socket. It ached, throbbing along with each beat of her heart. Everything started going hazy as the adrenaline wore off, and her vision doubled as she clung to consciousness. That stone must have been lodged deeper than she thought, because she was seeing things. It looked like her father was running up to her, but that couldn't be right. She was dimly aware of shouting, but it was drowned out by the ringing in her ears. The hallucination caught her before she hit the ground and drove the wooden shard even further into her side. Odd, she thought. It felt so very real. The stone had to be lodged more deeply than she originally guessed. Flashes of white light flickered in her eyes, leaving spots dotting her vision. Korra gasped and went limp, falling into darkness. Asami regretted not keeping up with her cardio while they were away, and her lungs burned as Mako bounded past her. Her outfit, too, was for meeting with politicians, not a foot chase. Jinora had been behind her the last time she glanced back, but the ground was too irregular to split her attention again. The air around the plaza was still singed from lightning and acrid with smoke, stinging her throat with every painful mouthful. Mako slid to take a hard corner, igniting a spout of flame from his palm for counterbalance before disappearing into the alley. Asami did the same with a gale of wind, almost rolling her ankle as she skittered down to a speed where she could make such a sharp turn. The alley was narrow and dingy, mottled with uneven ground and lined with fire escapes on either side. The same alley she found Korra fighting in, she noted with some amusement. It would be too enclosed for her or Mako to bend effectively in a straight fight, but there was still plenty she could do, if she could still see. Another blinding bolt of lightning tore down the alley, sizzling out of Mako's fingers and arcing wildly just as Korra's had in the humid air. It grounded out against a dumpster and flowed into the asphalt beneath their feet. The figure wheeled around Fu Shen, Asami saw, as if it could have been anyone else, and threw one of his kali sticks at Mako. Violet sparks crackled an instant before the end struck Mako in the chest, sending him to one knee. There wasn't enough force behind the strike to knock him out, but his bending would be unreliable at best for a few hours. Fu was already one flight up on the fire escape, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Jinora brushed by her and tried getting Mako back on his feet. Asami took a moment to size up the situation. She couldn't catch him on the fire escape, not in her current clothes. Her range of motion wasn't anywhere near what it was with proper combat gear. Besides, he still had one more kali stick he could throw at her with that uncanny aim of his. With a deep breath, Asami crouched, put her arms out, and swung around as she straightened her legs. The air whirled around her, drawing in toward her legs along with all the smoke and ash still hanging about them. She jumped, and for a moment she was weightless. The windows rushed by as she spiraled upward, spinning in a tight corkscrew. She braced herself for the dizziness, but it passed as she touched down on the store's vaulted roof. As soon as she got to the top of the fire escape, she heard the rattle of the metal stairs right below her. Her leg came up in a wide, sweeping kick, crashing into Fu's chest with a loud crack. He staggered back, reeling from having the wind knocked out of him, and Asami followed up with a rushing strike of air. It sent him over the railing of the fire escape and back down to the alley, where the sharp screech of breaking glass accompanied his landing. Her stomach turned. She hadn't wanted to kill him. Not yet, anyway. Asami sped down the fire escape, jumping down each flight rather than taking the stairs, and huffed a small sigh of relief when she saw he was still breathing. Jinora had gotten Mako to his feet, and he snapped the kali stick that struck him over his knee while Asami undid her belt and used it to bind Fu's hands and feet together. "You okay?" Asami asked, wiping her forehead with the sleeve of her jacket. Mako took the other kali stick, still in its holster, and snapped it as well before nodding. "Yeah. Always hated this guy. We should get back, Jinora." They glanced back at her. She had gone glassy-eyed again, staring at Fu while her hand drifted to the pommel of her sword. Mako hoisted him up onto his shoulder, taking care as he turned around to smack his head against a dumpster. Flashing lights and wailing sirens greeted them back in the plaza, where fire trucks were quelling a few flames in the buildings surrounding City Hall. A pair of ambulances had torn over the hedges and parked beside the main promenade, while medics carried Korra and Kuvira out on stretchers with Su trailing behind. Kuvira looked okay, but Korra looked like a bloody mess, and Asami felt her breath catch in her throat. Pepper still hadn't moved. Lin was pushing away a medic and directing him to focus on the avatar when they got to her. "Can I borrow your cuffs, Chief?" She looked at the man in the somewhat mangled Equalist uniform slung over Mako's shoulder and cracked the merest hint of a smile. Lin handed them over without a word and Mako dropped a barely conscious Fu against a lamp post. Asami retrieved her belt, handcuffed him securely to the pole, and ran to the ambulances. "The one time I want the police to show up and they're nowhere to be found," Mako muttered, walking off toward his brother. Lin went with him, to where Tenzin and Chief Tonrik were recovering on the steps of the treasury. Jinora stood there, alone, watching him slowly come to. He glared up at her, and then watched the medics load Korra onto the ambulance. "Aren't you a little young to be playing cop?" he asked, grimacing as he adjusted himself against the lamp post. Jinora clenched her jaw. "You don't remember me? Should I?" His voice grated at her ear, and a chill ran down her spine. "I guess not. That's okay. I remember you. I'm flattered." She stepped toward him and took her sword from its sheath. The thunderbolt iron gleamed in the early morning light. Its tip poked at the fabric of his uniform, over his heart, and he swallowed hard. "I remember you and your friends grabbing me at the pro bending arena. I remember you holding me up while that monster took my bending. I remember you shoving my face in the gutter to keep me quiet while you and your friends raped me over and over and over." Her sword hit the lamp post with a clang as it broke through the back of his chest. He seized, shuddering while his legs flailed ineffectually, and then fell still. A spray of warm, wet blood hit her face, mingling with the tears streaking down along her cheeks. She twisted her sword a few times for good measure, letting the metal work its way through him, then pulled it away and looked at the red covering the black blade. Her own shallow breathing was all she could hear, and all she could feel was a sick, gnawing sense of emptiness. No one else had arrived, and no one had been watching her. Her sword clattered to the ground, and Jinora walked calmly back to her bison, curling up against his unmoving body. "Please get up, Pepper, please. No, no change yet. You ought to get some sleep, Your Majesty." "I'm fine." Voices drifted in, hazy and distant. A door closed somewhere. She could smell sharp, pungent rubbing alcohol nearby, and she tried getting up. Her body responded as if it was moving through water, and all she could do was curl her unscarred hand into a fist. It was a start. She balled her hand up, feeling the skin on her palm, and then flattened it out. The sheets underneath her were soft and smooth. She flexed her wrist next, pitching her whole hand from side to side. That still worked, at least. Her elbow responded afterward, and on until she was able to open her eyes. White ceiling. Bright light. "Getting really tired of waking up in hospitals," she said quietly. "Cora." There was barely time to turn her head before Kuvira jumped onto the side of the bed, wrapping her arms around Cora and falling upon her with tearful kisses to her cheek. Cora brought her hands up, still fuzzy from non-use, and hugged her back. "Hey. You're okay, I was so scared," Kuvira said, tightening her grip. "What happened?" "I remember things getting stuck in me, lightning, are you okay?" Kuvira gently touched a bandage on the side of Cora's head. "I was knocked out, but they said you took the worst of it. Everyone wound up back at City Hall when the bomb went off. Mako and Asami got the guy, though. One of the Equalists, Asami, said it was the new leader. More bombs. I bet Bafong was glad to get her hands on him." "Well, not quite." "What do you mean?" She pulled back and sat in the chair beside Cora's bed. "Jinora was the only one they left watching him while they were taking us to the hospital. She skewered the guy." "Oh." Cora sat up, sitting against the bed for support. She didn't feel as if she needed it, but she remembered what happened the last time she tried to jump out of a hospital bed. After what they did to her, I can't say that I blame her. Mako and Asami said as much. Plus with what happened to Pepper, she couldn't have been in her right mind then. Her eyes widened, asking a silent question. Kuvira frowned and shook her head. He hit the building too hard. They weren't able to save him. No, Pepper. I'm sorry. They already gave him a sky burial. Cora sighed and leaned back, feeling a pit settle in her stomach. She put a hand on her gown and felt a large bandage on her side. When she pulled the gown away, Cora saw a patch of gauze affixed with surgical tape. The shard of wood, she remembered. That piece of chair was in there pretty deep, Kuvira said, lacing up their fingers. So was the stone in your head. Your doctor had to send you to surgery to get it out. They wouldn't let me bend it, they were worried you might start bleeding into your brain if it came it too fast. And now. They got it, no lasting damage except for a few marks. You have a really good healer. Kaed, I think her name is. She even used some of her stock of spirit water. Great, more scar tissue, Cora said, picking at the bandage on the side of her head with her free hand. That's not fair. I'm sure they did their best. I'm just so tired of people trying to blow me up. I think the building was the target, not us. There wasn't supposed to be anyone there at the time, the way Aunt Lin tells it. Lots of bad luck all around. At least no one else was in the building, they were all outside. Yeah. Bad luck. You know, that little rock got stuck so deep in my head I thought I saw my dad after the explosion. Cora laughed, and found out the hard way that her abdomen was still very sore. Must have rattled my brain real bad. Kuvira cocked an eyebrow. Your father is here, Cora. He and President Tenzin were on Pepper when he crashed. They're both okay, she added quickly. Huh, I thought it felt awfully real. Can you help me up? Cora, Kuvira began. I'm not going to try and storm off again, I just want to stand up. My butt is sore. How long have I been in here, anyway? 3 days. Here, let's get you moving a bit. She took Cora's hands and eased her to the side of the bed, carefully picking her up and setting her legs on the cold floor. Cora stood there for a moment in her embrace, enjoying the feeling of being held. When Kuvira backed away, keeping her arms out in case she had to catch her, Cora took an unsteady step, ready to grab something if she lost her balance. Much to her surprise, after the initial head rush and apart from soreness in her stomach and the side of her head, she felt remarkably normal. That spirit water was strong stuff, Cora thought. She took a few more steps, falling into her regular gait, and even tried bending. A clear bag full of saline nearby lifted off the counter, and sparks crackled around her scarred fingers. Well, that still works, she said to a grinning Kuvira. She turned around and saw the rest of the room. It didn't look much like a hospital ward. A small desk was pushed up against one wall, stacks of paper piled on either side. There was another bed, certainly, but none of the machinery she would expect to see was near it. A rose gold crown inlaid with silver and onyx sat on its nightstand. Were you living here? I didn't want you to wake up alone, Kuvira said sheepishly. Ambassador Lien's gotten very used to having meetings in here. Asami's been here when she isn't helping the police hunt down the rest of the Equalists, too. Cora smiled and fell against her, wrapping her arms around Kuvira's shoulders. You're such a dork. I'm your dork. She couldn't say any more before Cora pulled her into a deep kiss. Kuvira was so comfortably warm, so assuredly strong that she wanted to lose herself in her arms. The gown they gave her was thin, and she pressed up against her girlfriend, desperate to make up for 3 days of lost time and be as close to her as she could. Much like Opal, Chief Tonrik didn't seem to believe in knocking on doors. Maybe it was the tray of food in his hands. Cora heard the creak of the hinges, and could only give her father a sidelong glance while her tongue was halfway down Kuvira's throat. They both looked at him and froze, hoping to perhaps melt into the ground or disappear, but instead he became fascinated with the lace of his boot as he slowly stepped out of the room. Cora pulled away and rested her head on Kuvira's shoulder. When she was quite sure that she wasn't going to die of embarrassment, she almost had to laugh despite herself. Our kissing seems to attract people. Yeah, we'll have to work on that. Let me go talk to him for a minute. She went to the door and turned the handle before glancing back. Did I mention this is sort of the second time we've met in 20 years? Tonrik had retreated to the nurse's station, drumming his fingers on his lap. He glanced at Cora as she approached, both of them blushing deeply enough to show red through their skin, and he stood as she nervously approached him. Hi, Dad, she said, feeling a sudden lump in her throat. It's good to see you. Did you meet the new Earth Queen yet? She hugged her father, not knowing if he would withdraw or not, but he put his arms around her and patted her on the back. The warmth from him hit her, a welcome change from the chilly hospital corridor. You can relax, Cora. I've seen the newspapers. Even if I hadn't, her moving into your hospital room would have tipped me off. It was more surprising that you were up and about already, honest. Tonrik was an awful liar, but she appreciated his attempt to reduce her mortification all the same. Still, if he had seen the papers, that meant Asami had, too. Everyone would have seen it. Her stomach tightened a bit at the thought. How come you're in Republic City? Is Mom here? No, she's running things at the South Pole. I was coming back from your uncle's funeral and stopped here to take on supplies. Your friend Mako said you were due back soon, so I decided to stay. The president's family was very accommodating. I was on my way with him to the embassy when that bomb exploded and you stumbled out of City Hall. Cora wasn't exactly sure she would call Mako her friend. Prisoner, certainly. Acquaintance or teammate no, friend worked, she realized. He was too dependable to be anything else. The realization made her sink happily into Tonrik's vest. I'm glad you're here, Dad. Me too, sweetie. I'm so glad you're okay. He hugged her tighter, then paused. Cora. You need a shower, he said, as diplomatically as he could. She sniffed under her arm and cringed. Yeah. Come on, You don't have to wait out here. Is that your food? Tonrik took the tray from the counter and followed her back to her room. It was for the queen, actually. She hasn't been eating unless someone brings it in. Won't even go down to the cafeteria in case you woke up while she wasn't there. It'd be self-destructive if she couldn't have that ambassador bring lunches. She must really love you. That stopped Cora in her tracks, and she almost stumbled forward when the lip of the food tray bumped into her back. Her heart tightened up, and a tingling warmth ran through her chest as she started walking again. Yeah. She must really love you. Kuvira was at her desk, stamping a royal seal several times on a form with very tiny print when they returned. She snapped to her feet and cleared her throat as Cora came up and kissed her on the cheek. At ease, Sergeant, she whispered. Good to see you again, Chief. Cora, Asami brought you some new clothes, they're in the bag by your bed. Your Majesty, Tonrik said with a small nod. Please, Kuvira is fine. I don't intend on holding onto the crown for very long. Cora took the bag and retreated into the bathroom attached to her ward while they continued to talk. Politics, probably. Nothing she was very interested in overhearing. She glanced in the mirror before turning on the shower. They had shaved away a good deal of the hair on the side of her head to get at the stone lodged there, and in its place was a thin white line running from her ear to her eyebrow. More scar tissue, she said. The hot shower did wonders for her, and Cora stood under the stream for much longer than was necessary after washing herself, just to imagine all the ash and soot falling away. Droplets beat down along her skin, through her hair and along her scars. When it started getting cold, she shut the faucet, bent the remaining water down the drain, and looked in the mirror again. Her hair was uneven, she realized. It couldn't have been their intention, they cleared away what they had to so they could perform surgery, but it still bothered her. She looked in the bag Asami brought, and sure enough there was a small toiletry kit on top of some fresh clothes with a safety razor and a pair of scissors inside. She tried mirroring the hairline on the other side of her head, but she decided that looked stupid. Maybe a little higher off the sides. When she was done, there was a great deal of hair on the floor around her feet, and the sides of her head were almost completely shaved down. The back tapered to a sharp point, ending above the nape of her neck. She was proud of getting that right without being able to see it, at least. Cora rummaged for a tie in the bag, fixed her remaining hair in a high, tight ponytail, and got dressed. The new clothes were much like her old ones, but slightly softer and with a heavier feel to them. A slot for a knife, which she also found in the toiletry bag, fit snugly on the inside of one boot. Her pants even had built-in loops to accommodate water skins, which she also found in the bag and filled from the sink. The detached sleeves were different, though. While they were the same style, the new sleeves were a lighter, more permeable fabric that stretched with the tug of her fingers. She slipped one over her scarred arm and found that, while the baseline level of discomfort was still there, it did nothing to irritate the skin like the old one had. Cora, I repurposed some strike-resistant fabric from our labs. Won't stop a knife, but your arms and torso should feel a lot more durable now. Not that you needed the help. Hope I got all the measurements right. Asami. She smiled as she read the note a few more times before tucking it into her pants pocket. After carefully blowing all of her shorn hair into the trash, Cora took one last look in the mirror and finally liked what she saw. Other than the hair, she looked like her old self again. She looked strong. She felt strong. The door clicked shut behind her, and Kuvira and her father looking at her brought on a sudden and unwelcome rush of self-consciousness. So, how's it look? Wolf tail, Tonrik said approvingly. Very nice. How did you get that kind of symmetry? Kuvira asked, tilting her head. Not sure. Avatar power. Will they try and haul me back in here if I leave? This is a lot more time than I planned on staying in Republic City, and we still have to deal with getting the army. We've gotten that taken care of, Kuvira said. General Iroh and Admiral Yin, my cousin, actually are going to lead the peacekeeping force. My mother's going with them, she asked me not to come. She chewed on her tongue for a moment, gazing downcast at her boots. They don't want to lose another queen, Kuvira said. Are you and her okay? Cora asked. I can't imagine she took all this well. We'll be fine. I think she needs time to adjust. Asami, Mako and I will be ready to leave first thing in the morning. So we're all set then, Chief. Tonrik nodded. I'll have ships dispatched to the southern coast and Kyoshi Island as soon as I get back. Just make sure they know we're coming. They'll know. Thankfully most of the infrastructure aside from Ba Sing Se is still standing. After her healer, a bubbly young woman named Kaed, finally cleared her to leave, Korra helped Kuvira pack up her things and took the elevator down with her and Tonrik. Lin was strolling into the lobby as they arrived, or at least walking as casually as she could, considering her leg brace. Welcome back, she said, trying very hard not to show that she was leaning on a row of chairs for support. Aunt Lin. I thought you were at home, Kuvira said, adjusting the crown on her arm. Can't go home. Your mom got the rest of your family in this morning. There are bufangs everywhere in my house. My mom won't stop complaining about how the furniture feels, your dad almost burned my kitchen down, and those brothers of yours I can't tell apart keep trying to build some kind of sports pit in the backyard. Hey, Linear. Korra popped one of her water skins open and floated out almost half of the water inside. Open up the armor on your leg. I told you, this is all my healer could do and she's one of the best. Just do it. Lin rolled her eyes, retracted the armor over her calf, and rolled up the fabric over her leg. The skin there was a sickly purple, twisted up where it had burned and fused to the metal. She clenched her jaw and looked away, making every effort not to meet the gazes of the people around them. Korra knelt down, placed the water over her calf, and let the white glow block out her eyes. The water glowed as it moved up and down the skin, so brightly that the entire room lit up. She kept the water cycling for several minutes, focusing on her work, before the light faded and she snaked it back into the water skin on her hip. Some pitting remained on her skin, but the discoloration was gone. Slowly, unbelievingly, Lin put weight on her leg, and Korra actually saw her break out in a smile. Once her armor was all back in its proper position, Lin threw her arms around Korra, struggling to hold back tears. When she remembered herself and the polite applause of the people in the lobby caught up to her, she took a step back and rubbed the back of her neck. No more leg brace, huh? Korra asked with a grin. Thank you, Korra, she said with a deep, shuddering breath. Thank you. Now that I helped you out, you're not going to do anything about Jinora, right? Lin shrugged. Why would I? Did she do something? Thanks. Korra and Kuvira stepped out of the hospital ahead of Lin and Tonrik, where a small army of reporters and photographers had camped out. Countless lights went off in her face, and she could barely see Mako, Asami and Bolin pushing their way through the sea of people to get up the steps. Maybe my calling them tipped off the press, Kuvira said with an embarrassed smile. When they finally got past the throng, Asami grabbed them both and pulled them into a tight hug. I'm so glad you're all right, love the hair, by the way. Thanks. Wolf tail. Korra nuzzled into Asami's shoulder before taking a deep breath. Lilac shampoo, she noted with a flutter in her chest. And all of your measurements were right. You have the worst luck with bombs, Mako said. Korra hugged him, too. Hugged her friend. Mako tensed up, but warmly returned her embrace after a moment. Are you going to do that every time you see me now? Don't get used to it, hey. Bolin nudged his brother aside to shake Korra's hand, looking at the cameras more than her. All manner of flashes went off in her eyes, and reporters threw questions at her like knives. She noted, with some annoyance, that most of them were about her and Kuvira rather than the state of the Earth Kingdom. It wasn't easy, but the Queen and I managed to convince the President to part with a bit more of the United Forces, Bolin said to her. Korra glanced behind him to Mako, who shook his head. There'll be a proper force to help bring some order back to Ba Sing Se and wherever else it's needed. Well, thanks, Mr. Vice President, Korra said dryly. If you'll excuse us. Though she made a big show of grumbling about it, Lin ultimately offered the remaining guest rooms of her house to Korra, Kuvira and Asami for the one night they were staying. There was one empty bedroom beside her own where she had set 2 extra beds, and for some reason made a point of mentioning how very thin the walls were before leaving them to their own devices after dinner. I guess all the bufangs live in style, Korra said, falling backward onto warm, fresh sheets. No idea why Mako would skip out on a bed like this. Kuvira looked in the bag of her things her siblings brought from Zaofu as she began undoing her braid. Anything would be an upgrade from that hospital cot. I hit the remote one night in my sleep and almost folded myself in half. She yelped before she could finish with her hair, leaning back when Cora pressed in behind her. The light kisses on her neck garnered a contented moan, silenced only when they remembered Asami was there with them, leaning against the far wall with a weak smile. "Oh, sorry," Cora said, still nuzzled into Kuvira's cheek. Her voice was wavering, but resolute. "Don't be. I'm glad you're both happy. I actually have to meet with the contractor who's going to fix up my house. I can't leave it alone for another month. You never know quite how many windows you have until you have to replace most of them. I'll be back in the morning." Opal set up a bed for me in her room. She left, her footsteps padding off toward the front door. Cora leaned back, fidgeting with the scars on her hand. Kuvira put a hand in her lap. "What now?" Her brow furrowed, but then an idea hit Cora. "Do you like jazz?" "When I'm not being pressed into singing it, yes." "Why?" "Mako said he had a place that played it. Where did I put his phone number? Here it is." She took the phone in their room from its stand, and Kuvira slipped out for the bathroom while Cora spent several minutes figuring out exactly how to dial a number, jumping in excitement when it began ringing. "Hello." Cora took the handset from her ear and looked at it for a moment, perplexed. "So? Oh, hi Cora, I was glad to hear you're up and about. I was in meetings all day with the ambassador, otherwise I would have come to the hospital. Diplomats love their meetings. What can I do for you?" "I was calling Mako, actually. I must have mixed up the numbers." No. Cora could hear some muffled movement in the background, but couldn't place it. "You have the right number. Mako's a bit tied up right now, that's why I picked up. Let me get him for you." She heard footsteps, and then a rather labored bout of breathing. "Ah, not a great time, Water Tribe." "Mako? Are you okay? Why is Sue at your house?" Cora asked, idly winding the phone cord around her finger. "I'm fine. I was thinking of redecorating when we get back from the Fire Nation and wanted her opinion on some things." "Did you need something? You had mentioned a jazz club you owned around here," Cora asked. "Oh, yeah, it's called Dragon. Corner of Schwinnen and Jigwang. Big purple sign out front. Tell them I sent you, they'll take care of you." "Mako, you're all out of breath, are you going to be able to leave in the morning?" "Of course," he said, his breathing leveling off. "I've got your back, Cora. Beats rotting in a cell, at least. Now I really have to go." The line went dead with an unceremonious click, and Kuvira returned a moment later. She noticed Cora's confused look and put a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" Mako was weird. "Well, more than usual. But I got the address, if you want to go." She stepped closer and took Cora's hands in her own. "Who knows how many more opportunities we'll get to have fun like this. Let's try and enjoy tonight." A pang struck through Cora's chest, but she ultimately nodded. "Yeah." Once they finished fighting their way through the reporters outside Lin's home and got downtown, Cora realized she had no idea where either cross street Mako had mentioned was. After getting directions, the path was clear enough, and soon they were looking at a rather long line extending from a building with a purple neon dragon on the front. "This is probably it," Cora said, trying to ignore the people in the line slowly turning toward them. The doorman became very accommodating once Cora dropped Mako's name, and they were thankfully led to a private booth on the second floor, where they had an unobstructed view of the stage below and the band as they warmed up. A waitress came out of nowhere and left them a bottle of sake and a pair of glasses before vanishing again, leaving them by themselves as the first few notes hummed out over the speakers. Cora filled both glasses and slid one over. "Here. I won't even try to get you to sing." "How sweet of you." She clinked her glass to Cora's and belted it back, drawing out a hiss as it went down. "To one hell of a day. Aren't you supposed to do that before you drink it?" "Usually." Kuvira leaned against Cora, resting her cheek on Cora's shoulder. "But it really has been a long day and I didn't want to wait. I agreed to an interview that didn't accomplish anything that I wanted. I gave my permission to open the borders to the United Forces and the Southern Water Tribe Navy. Just pour me another drink, please. She did so, and Cora swished her own glass before letting it burn its way down her throat. Warmth slowly spread from her stomach to her fingers and toes. To one hell of a day. She made a mental note to thank Mako begrudgingly, of course, for the special treatment. Deep, rhythmic music filled the air, giving them something to focus on while they sat and kissed and touched. Cora quietly pushed the bottle away after 3 drinks, mindful of the early morning she had planned, and Kuvira didn't seem to notice when her glass was never refilled. I still can't believe you moved into a hospital room, Cora said, wavering in her seat while her chest grew lighter as the drinks began to catch up with her. Kuvira shrugged, almost curled up into Cora's side. What can I say? I can't resist the smell of gauze and formaldehyde. Dork. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart beat a little faster. That's why I love you. Her stomach did a somersault as the words slipped past her lips, and Kuvira slowly turned so that she was facing Cora. Her cheeks flushed red while she blinked a few times. Cora took a deep breath, fidgeting with her hands, and Kuvira leaned forward and kissed her, hard. There was little grace to it, drunk as they were, and instead it was all passion, messy and wet and wonderful all at once. Kuvira cupped her cheeks, and while there was little space between Cora and their table, Kuvira managed to swing her leg over so that she was straddling Cora. She put her arms around Kuvira's waist to keep her there, and small points of moisture trickled down onto her cheeks. Cora pulled back and saw she was shuddering, tears slowly rolling down her face. Kuvira. Say it. Her hands ran up into what remained of Cora's hair, carefully avoiding the stitches still in her temple. Say it again. Cora pressed her forehead to Kuvira's, holding her as close as she possibly could. Their breaths were ragged, unsteady, expectant. She waited for another jolt of excitement to pass through her body before she trusted herself to speak again. Chapter 30, Strain. Waking up in a haze and to a face full of hair made Cora decide that she much preferred being the little spoon. She tried to work herself free, but one arm was stuck under Kuvira's side, and she was still fast asleep. Cora looked out the window and saw the sun peeking over the mountains outside the city, sending her into a panic. Hey, wake up. Kuvira only grumbled and latched tighter to the arm she had claimed. Come on, Kuvira. She rocked back and forth to no avail, knocking against the wall and losing the sheets to the floor. Cora shook the rest of Kuvira's hair out of her face, moving her head up just enough to see the door open. Oh, hey Lin, she said, remembering that they were both quite naked. Lin only rolled her eyes. Quit hitting the wall. So tired of people having more fun than me in my own house. The door slid shut again. Cora put her free arm around Kuvira and sat them both up, jostling her enough to rouse her. Okay, up and at them, we have assassinations to stop. Ugh, my head, she said through a groan, pinching the bridge of her nose as she did. How much sake did we drink? Probably too much. Let's get ready, I wanted to be gone by now. And we have to go wrangle Mako, I have no idea where he is. Where is his house, anyway? Please stop talking so loud. Once they got some water, their minds cleared up a bit, and they were able to get themselves ready to go. Kuvira had only a small rucksack that would stow easily enough, and Lin had lent Cora a satchel to replace the shredded bag laying in what remained of City Hall. As much fun as Cora thought it would be to shower together, they were in such a rush that it was remarkably utilitarian and devoted more to lessening their hangovers. None of Kuvira's siblings were quite sure how to address her until she slipped the crown off her arm and stuffed it in her bag. Even then, their rushed breakfast was thick with tension, broken only when Sa wandered into the kitchen with mussed hair and light bags under her eyes. Asami came in shortly after from the room she had shared with Opal, packed and ready to go. Lin pursed her lips and poured her sister a cup of coffee as she sat beside her husband. Are you okay, Mom? Kuvira asked, picking at a few leftover bayazai. Not much sleep. I'll have to catch up in the convoy. She worked a kink out of her neck and sipped at her coffee. It'll be a while before we get anywhere near Ba Sing Se. Opal shifted in her seat and glanced at her brothers and father. Do you really have to go there? You didn't hear the reports that came in before we left Zaofu. It's a war zone. We agreed on Earth Kingdom oversight for the peacekeeping operation, so yes, I have to. I doubt I'll be in the thick of it, honey. That'll be my job anyway, Lin said, checking one of the straps on her armor. They all looked at her. You're coming too? Sue asked. Why not? It's a police action, there should be some police there. My leg's fine now, and Hyan's doing an okay job running things here. There's something I want to be well away from the station for, so it's either go with the army or stay here with Mom. Sue shuddered. Point taken. I heard that, Toph shouted from her room. Korra slid her satchel strap over her head and onto her shoulder. We should get down there. The drive to the south end of the city after they said their goodbyes was quiet, as if all of them were waiting for someone else to say something. Kuvira kept sneaking glances at her mother, who seemed very interested in the buildings rushing by the car window. Lin drummed her fingers on her lap and looked over every so often at Asami as she navigated them through the morning traffic. Korra looked at her too, or at least at the part of her head she could see from the back seat. She was either handling things well, or had learned not to wear her upset as openly as she had after being saddled with airbending. How conceited, Korra thought, to imagine she and Kuvira would affect her on the same scale as that. Still, she found herself concerned. Asami was one of her only friends, her first friend, and she cared deeply about her well-being. Maybe more than her own. At the same time, her hand unconsciously found Kuvira's, clasping and fitting together with comforting familiarity. With love. Everything was so much simpler when all I had to do was train. Asami pulled the car into the staging area at the southern city limits. There were a dozen large airships moored in 2 neat rows, and more trucks than Korra could count dotted the spaces between them. A smaller airship was anchored on the other side of the area, and in between them a few people milled about. Reporters and photographers were outside of the main area, hurling questions. The car slowed to a halt, and they filed out as Korra looked around. Mako was there, and he straightened up when he saw them approaching. Tonrik, Tenzin, and Bolin were with him, as well as a man and a woman in military uniforms that Korra didn't know. All of them nodded respectfully as Kuvira stepped out of the back of the car. Please, that's not necessary, she said, reaching back to tug at the base of her braid. I'm not going to get used to that. Bolin took a step forward, and the man and woman beside him did the same. Avatar Korra, Your Majesty, this is General Iroh and Admiral Yin. He'll be directing the ground and air forces, she has command of the naval units standing by on the north coast. The Queen and I met already, Yin said. She was taller than them, and even a bit taller than Asami, with dark green eyes and gray-streaked black hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. Cousin. It's a pleasure to meet you as well, Avatar Korra. The Second Fleet will head around the northern coast and link up with the Southern Water Tribe forces near Shanbei, as we discussed. Kuvira nodded and inched closer to Korra. The same tamped-down impulses from her youth threatened to bubble up, and she took a moment to compose herself and shrug it off. Admiral. General. Please just call me Korra. I'm sorry I wasn't able to meet you earlier, I was indisposed. That seemed like the best way to put it. But I'm glad to see you here. When everything's done in the Fire Nation, I'll be lending whatever support I can in the Earth Kingdom. We appreciate that, Korra, Iroh said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Apprehension marked his features, which were otherwise quite attractive, she thought. Ah, my family, the royal family, rather please keep them safe. I intend to. There was something she never thought she would ever say. But then, Korra thought as her fingers drifted toward Kuvira's, there were a great many things happening that she never imagined. She hugged her father tightly, leaving Kuvira to stand awkwardly beside her. Oh, you too, Your Majesty, he said, sweeping her up as well. She yelped as she crushed in against Korra, but tentatively returned his hug after a moment. You come back home after this, Korra. I can't lose you again. I will, Dad. We'll go ice dodging. She nuzzled into his chest, wondering if she would ever get the chance. Mako tapping on his watch got her out of her reverie. I know I don't have a fancy title like Admiral or Chief or anything, but there's a storm coming in from the north and we don't want to get caught in it. Right. Is that us? Korra asked, pointing to the smaller airship set away from the others. Asami nodded. One Raiden-class fast attack interceptor, fresh out of my workshop. I didn't even get a chance to name it yet. Pepper, Korra said. Its name is Pepper. Let's head out. There were a few political niceties to observe, and Korra and Kuvira made their formal goodbyes to Tenzin, Bolin, Yin and Iroh. Kuvira nearly jumped into her mother's arms, ignoring whatever discomfort they had let simmer for the past few days, and Su hugged her in return, wrapping her arms around her daughter and squeezing. I love you, Mom. I love you too, honey. We'll see each other soon. Lin took a reluctant hug from her as well as Su pecked Mako on the cheek, out of sight of both of them, but not a bewildered Korra and Asami. Come back in one piece, she whispered, quietly enough so that she thought no one else could hear. Sure thing, Mako mumbled, his face thoroughly red. Korra was still trying to puzzle that out while Su shook her and Asami's hands. That looked to be everyone, but then Lin came up to Mako. Her usual scowl faltered as she stepped closer to him. I know, back in jail as soon as we're done. You don't have to remind me. Again. Lin didn't say anything at first, and instead slowly put her arms around him in the most awkward hug any of them had ever seen. They all looked shocked, but no one more so than Mako, who could only stand stock still while his eyes began to water. He hugged her back, shaking through ragged breaths. You have so much potential, she said, her voice thick from biting back tears of her own. Have. Not had. She tried to ease away, but he stayed in place and won out. A few more moments passed before they separated, and Mako tried and failed to inconspicuously wipe his eyes dry. Asami smiled and nudged his arm as they started for their airship. Korra glanced over at the press nearby. We've dealt with them. As far as they know, we're heading back into the Earth Kingdom, Kuvira said. I made the interview very convincing. Once we're in the air, we can turn around and head west. No one else knows we're going to the Fire Nation. Good. If Zahir thinks he has room to breathe, he might slip up. Ready. Let's go. They followed Mako and Asami up the airship's gangplank. It was modestly appointed, dotted with the occasional luxury while still being very obviously a military craft. A small kitchenette and bathroom replaced the bomb storage, and above the storage cabinets were 4 tatami beds. 2 short benches faced one another right behind the controls, and a table popped up between them to set food on. Asami, you did this in 3 days? Korra asked, setting her bag down against a cabinet full of flares. I was helping direct the Equalist raids, she said while turning dials and flipping switches at the controls. A bunch of Future Industries engineers worked nights. We should have enough food and fuel to make it well into the Fire Nation, if not all the way to Kasai. There are pontoons that inflate on the fuselage so we can land on the water at night, too. Kuvira hit the button to retract the gangplank while the rotors began spinning up. This really is amazing. How far do you think we have to go with the convoy? The ship lurched around them, and they began to rise. On the other side of the field, the larger craft were gaining altitude as well, and the sound of dozens of trundling truck engines split the silence that had otherwise claimed the morning. Probably only a few minutes, Asami said, spinning the wheel until they faced east. We'll get above the clouds and then double back. Mako fought back a yawn and looked around the kitchen. They said refugees were already starting to arrive the other day. Hope they brought a big enough army. Thank you again for the relief centers, Kuvira said. Korra cocked an eyebrow. She hated missing things while in hospitals. What, did he get Bolin to spring for them? No, he wouldn't go for it, so I paid for them. Mako looked back at Korra. I know what it's like not to have a home. Don't tell anyone, I have my reputation to think about. Rain began to patter down the Pepper's envelope, leaving it to drizzle along the windows that lined all the walls. Asami kept them on a steady ascent into the approaching storm, blending into the flotilla assembling over the trucks. Korra watched out a side window as they rose even higher and broke through the cloud cover, casting a shroud over Republic City. Okay, we're out of sight. That was faster than I thought it would be. Asami brought the wheel around again, setting them westward and moving forward at a steady clip. With any luck, the storm will keep us hidden. Don't need anyone wiring ahead about a rogue airship. Their luck held for the first time, and the clouds covered their departure until they were well over the Mocec. Korra breathed a sigh of relief, and Mako crawled up to one of the beds while Kuvira joined Asami at the helm. Korra snuck up behind him on the narrow ladder and rolled onto the bed adjacent to the one he had claimed. He cracked one bleary eye and curled up tighter around a pillow. Wouldn't usually complain about a girl trying to get into bed with me, but I really just want to sleep right now, Water Tribe. A flush built up on her cheeks and the back of her neck. Yeah, don't flatter yourself. What's going on with you and Su? Nothing. In case you didn't notice, she and Lin were heading in the opposite direction. Korra whacked him on the arm. Knock it off. Last night. What was that? I called and you sounded like you ran a marathon. I like to think I have a little more stamina than that. There was a nice rug I was thinking about getting when we're through in the Fire Nation and I get out of jail. I wanted a woman's opinion on how it'd look in my living room. You've never seen my place, but I have no talent for interior design. She helped me out last night. 3 times, he added with a smirk. You really expect me to believe that? Believe whatever you want. As much as I'm sure you'd love to sit here and listen to how much of a wreck I really am and how Sa helps with that by acting like she actually gives a damn, I'm tired. Go hang out with your girlfriends. It's a long way to Kasai. Girlfriend, Korra corrected. I told you that. Yeah, well, call it what you like. Asami's still got it bad for you, but I think you knew that already. Don't get on me about this, okay? You have no idea how complicated this stuff can get. I don't know, I once met these twins from the Northern Water Tribe. You know what, you're probably the last person who wants to hear about that, Mako said, pausing for a moment to reminisce. Look, Kuvira and I had a good time at your club last night, so I'm not going to press this, but don't bring up her mom, okay? That's a whole other mess we don't need hanging over us right now. Mako nodded, closed his eyes, and was asleep before Korra finished climbing down the ladder. Loath as she still was to agree with him about anything, she was tired. The early morning she wanted had been foiled by a late night, and while that was fine by her, she found her eyelids growing heavier and heavier. She laid down on one of the benches and nestled in there, looking at Kuvira and Asami with a smile as she drifted off. Her breathing was all that surrounded her, the only meager point of reference in a womb of nothingness. She tried straightening out, but she might as well have tried moving through stone for all the good it did her. Korra's heart began to race, throbbing painfully in her chest, and she strained harder and harder to break free. When she forced her eyes open, she found herself laying in a field of rolling hills and strange, faintly glowing violet flowers. There was an unnatural stillness to the place, and as she stood up she saw the land around her contorting into shapes that could never exist, fading into colors she had no names for. Spirit world, she murmured, taking an uncertain step forward. The ground lurched beneath her, rippling as if it were water with a pebble dropped in. Korra gasped as the vibrant flowers withered around her, blackened petals curling and twisting before the whole field fell dead. The Avatar shouldn't be a murderer. All you are is a failure. Do you feel like a hero yet, Avatar? She pressed her hands to the sides of her head, trying to shake it clear while the words clung and gnawed at her. Korra cried out and stumbled blindly forward, giving no mind to where she might be going. With each step more and more flowers died, until even the grass underneath them turned a sickly, lifeless brown. Stop it, stop it, stop it, I'm a good Avatar, I am. You're nothing but a foolish, short-sighted woman. It was her own voice mocking her, she realized. Her voice worming the words into her ear, trying to find purchase in the cracks the same way Zahir had for so many years. She fell least she thought she fell, there was no feeling but she wound up on the ground regardless, and when she tried to stand, everything looked taller, or so it seemed. Korra looked down at herself and saw no scars, no armor. Only the simple gray tunic she wore as a child hanging from her 4-year-old frame. Everything around her rumbled, sending her to the ground and splitting her lip on the stone underneath her. The salty, metallic taste of blood dribbled onto her tongue as hard earthen walls rose around her, shutting out the twilight and leaving her barely enough room to sit up. A nightmare, she thought. Or a memory. She had to test it to be sure. Korra reached out into the stone and tried to bend her way out, but there was only a weak prickling at the base of her spine, not the rush of energy there should have been. A memory, then. She blocked and trapped in a box to force her to overcome her fear of the dark, left there all night while they pretended to be deaf to her cries. Panic set in just as it had so many years ago, and her throat felt tight as she clawed at the walls until her fingers left wet red streaks everywhere they touched. She tried to wipe her eyes dry, but only succeeded in smearing blood all over her face. Cora wasn't sure how long she remained in there, and only began to notice anything when she felt the walls closing in on her. She shrieked, her juvenile voice running raw in her throat, and struck back against the walls as they began pressing her into a painful curl. Her toes ground against the floor in a useless attempt to stop the advance, and her arms bent back on themselves as she tried to hold the walls at bay. Her voice blew out from screaming, and all she could manage were painful, muted sobs. And then the walls turned to dust around her, fading away as quickly as they had sprung up. Her voice was still gone, but the rest of her seemed fine. She was back in her home, or what it had been before exploding, in the same corner of the kitchen where she had been blocked and confined every night for 3 weeks. Everything was still bathed in twilight as if no time had passed at all, and a quick glance out the window told her she was back on their island with no fields of dead flowers in sight. She tried waking up, to no avail. Rapid blinking, pinching her arm, looking at the writing of the to-do list on the counter, it all failed to rouse her. "It's a dream, it's a dream," she repeated over and over as she wandered through the house. Everything was exactly as she remembered it the day she left, apart from the fact that she was the only one there and it was deathly quiet. Her foot snagged on an edge of the carpet and she fell to her knees, breaking her fall on something cold and stiff. Cora's gaze traced down to her once more scarred hands, which she found wrapped around Minghua's lifeless neck. Red pooled around her head, mottled in some places with bits of pink leaking from the back of her skull. She retched and heaved, losing mouthful after mouthful of thick, black, burning bile before falling on her side into a pile of charred bones, what was left of Gazan, she assumed. Cora swiped at them, letting the bones clatter into the wall and stand watch while she seized. There was no noise when she tried to scream, only a raw and painful rubbing in her throat. She looked at her hands as they jerked forward under their own power, her agency gone. Red ran along the scars on her arms, replacing the off-white with scarlet that dripped down in the shape of lotus petals. "You are a tool. These are our hands, not yours." 4 voices in tandem, voices she recognized, scratching along inside her ears like so many knives. She pounded her head against the floor, trembling while the red lotus petals continued falling from her arms, engulfing her. "You're as much a part of the red lotus as we are." One voice. Zahir's voice, ringing out in her head while she laid buried under the petals. "Drag your friends along to find us if you must. And then there will only be one member left. You. And they will turn on you, just like you turned on us. Fall on your sword and save them the trouble. Cora. Cora." She awoke with a strangled breath, feeling the leather of the bench pressing on her cheek. Her heart was racing, pounding so fast and so hard she thought it might break right through her chest. Tears dotted her vision before rolling down her face, changing direction as she sat up. Kuvira and Asami were in front of her, standing there without being quite sure what to do. She looked at her arm, and was never so happy to see the plain off-white of her scars there. "Guys. Are you okay?" Asami asked, putting a light hand on Cora's shoulder. "You were screaming bloody murder in your sleep, we couldn't wake you up." "Nightmare," she mumbled, swallowing a few times to make sure everything was working properly. The sun had set, and all she could see out the windows was inky blackness and the occasional indicator light on the exterior of the fuselage. "How long was I out?" 12 hours, almost, Kuvira said. "I didn't want to wake you up. You didn't start shouting until a few minutes ago." "Sorry. It was a really bad one." "Yeah, we gathered that." Mako popped up the table in front of her bench with his foot and set a plate of food in front of her. "Here, I made dinner. There's some chocolate in the cabinet over there, it helps with this kind of thing." Cora looked down at the plate, and while it looked slightly reheated, it seemed more than edible, even appetizing. "You cook?" He shrugged and put utensils beside the plate. "You'd be surprised how much of a turn-on that can be." Asami and Kuvira both nodded, if only reluctantly. When the pontoons had inflated and the Pepper touched down, rolling lightly with the waves, Cora climbed up onto one of the storage cabinets and pushed the 2 tatama beds there together. 12-hour nap notwithstanding, she was dead tired, and felt her eyelids growing heavy as soon as Kuvira laid down beside her. One arm came over her side, squeezing protectively as Kuvira pressed into her back. Asami shut down the last of the controls and climbed up beside Mako, pausing for a moment before pulling her bed slightly away from his. Everything was silent, and sleep should have come easily, but Cora only laid awake for hours. The airship rocked with the gentle motion of the waves, which should have soothed her, while her mind raced and the lingering words in her head played over and over. You are a tool. You're as much a part of the Red Lotus as we are. Fall on your sword and save them the trouble. Kuvira nuzzled into her neck, and Cora took a deep breath, wondering if she really was damaged beyond repair, wondering just how many Red Lotus members had to die. Check the description for the links to the author.